Chapter 179, Mr. Night King, Tear Down This Wall, Part 2. The Trident 2 BC. Torrhen Stark had marched relentlessly, leading the largest army the North had ever assembled. Over 30,000 men had crossed through the neck, and yet it all seemed for nothing. As he sat in his tent, contemplating his next move, he sighed deeply when his brother Brandon entered. Torrhen could already anticipate Brandon's words, but he listened nonetheless. Despite his obvious displeasure, he allowed his brother to speak passionately about his plans and how they would succeed. "Our bows are strong, brother. We can take them down, and without their dragons, they are nothing," Brandon said, a hint of laughter in his tone. "And what of their men?" Torrhen inquired, looking directly at him. "They're no match for us. Some will abandon the dragons once their beasts are slain," Brandon replied confidently. "And if they don't? If they hold their ground, we'll face an army larger than ours, with far more cavalry and much better armor," Torrhen cautioned, trying to convey the seriousness of the situation. It wasn't just the dragons he feared, though fear was certainly a factor. "Southern men, not Northmen, men unlike us. We can defeat them, brother. Without their beasts, we can win," Brandon insisted, urging Torrhen to accept his words. "What if you fail, brother? What if one dragon escapes, or what if not all of them are there? You heard what Balerion did to Harrenhal and what they did to the Lannisters and the Gardeners on the Field of Fire. Am I to gamble the lives of our men on a plan that may not work?" Torrhen asked, his voice rising in frustration. "What's the alternative, brother? Kneel and beg for scraps from a dragon's table? Are you a wolf, or is there mouse blood in your veins?" Brandon challenged. In a flash of anger, Torrhen's fist connected sharply with Brandon's cheek, sending him crashing to the ground. "You doubt me, a wolf?" he snarled. Brandon looked up at him, blood trickling from his mouth, and spat before rising to his feet. Torrhen smiled slightly as he spoke. "I just wanted to make sure the wolf was still inside you. What do you wish of me?" Brandon replied, "Go and speak to Aegon Targaryen. Seek him out and see what he offers. I won't spill more northern blood than necessary." Brandon nodded, then turned to leave. "Take your guards with you," Torrhen added. "Have them dress in the maester's robes." Brandon chuckled as he departed. After some time, Brandon returned, but the note he brought back was not what Torrhen had expected. He looked at it, then handed it to Brandon, who seemed just as surprised. "This can't be true," Brandon exclaimed after reading it. "No, but it's a strange lie to fabricate, isn't it? What do you think of the man himself?" Torrhen asked, curious. "A warrior who is both fierce and focused. This is not a man who offers terms lightly, yet he seemed." "Brandon?" Torrhen interrupted, noticing his brother had drifted off in thought. "Brandon? What? Sorry. He seemed almost to be expecting me. He said something I thought was odd at the time, though now I'm not so sure." Torrhen looked at him, eager to learn more. "What did he say?" "That my maesters would be more at home with a sword in their hands than a book." Torrhen smirked. Aegon had either seen through his ruse or had simply anticipated it, either possibility giving him pause and concern. "Send a note and arrange a meeting, just you, me, and him, Brandon, with guest rights to be offered and accepted," Torrhen instructed. Brandon nodded before leaving him alone. Torrhen opened the note and read it once more. "Wolves and dragons should howl together, for in time our kin will bring the dawn." Torrhen made a few notes before he and his brother set out to meet Aegon Targaryen. The meeting was to take place far too close to the dragon's lair for Torrhen's comfort. While he conceded that guest rights were an acceptable tradition, Aegon had only agreed to leave his dragon behind once they had all partaken in the customary bread and salt. As they approached the meeting place, the shape of the dragon loomed in the distance. Balerion was as dark as the night sky, and without its movement, it would have been nearly invisible. Brandon might have believed that his weirwood bows and arrows could match such a beast, but Torrhen was far less convinced. He also doubted that Aegon's army would be as easy to defeat as his brother assumed. True, he could retreat to the moat and hold them off, but then what? What would be his next move? What if just one of Brandon's arrows missed its mark, or what if his brother was proven wrong? "We've come to treat at your request," Torrhen said as they arrived. Aegon smiled and took some bread and salt from a plate he held, offering some to Torrhen and Brandon. "The dragon?" Brandon asked, and Torrhen watched with interest as Aegon turned toward the beast. "Suvgan Naja Eohamandia, Balerion," Aegon commanded. "Fly to your sisters, Balerion." As the dragon took to the air, its true size was revealed, causing even Brandon to doubt his plans. Torrhen looked at Aegon, noting his short silver hair and the way his purple eyes barely glimmered in the darkness. Aegon wore a shirt of black scales and a silver circlet adorned with square-cut rubies. The sword at his hip was made of Valyrian steel, just like ice. But where ice was a great sword, Blackfire was a long sword, and Aegon stood tall, matching both Brandon and Torrhen in stature. Aegon was undeniably powerfully built. He was a warrior through and through, and that alone commanded Torrhen's respect. "Your words were not what I expected," Torrhen said. "Neither was your march," Aegon replied. "You thought we would stay north of the neck while you conquered all the land south of it?" Brandon asked. "I hoped you would," Aegon said with a sigh. "I have no quarrels with House Stark, no more than the current circumstances demand. I intended to come to you once my war was finished, but here we are, and an accord must be reached." Aegon looked directly at Torrhen, ignoring Brandon. "What accord is that?" Torrhen asked, locking eyes with him. "House Stark will kneel and relinquish its crown. Once that is done, I will name you and your heirs as Wardens of the North and Lords of Winterfell. I'll leave the North largely to its own devices and will not ask more of it than it's willing to give." Brandon interjected, speaking for Torrhen. "You offer us no more than what is already ours by right and seek far more in return. Why would we even consider such a thing? Daenerys dreamed, and so we came, escaping the doom that took our lands from us," Aegon explained. "Yet our arrival was not without purpose. In time, a war will come that you and I will not be here to fight, a war that only a son with both our blood can win. When that war comes, I do not know, nor do I know who that son will be. But I know he is the prince that was promised, the Psalm of Ice and Fire, the White Wolf, and the Winter Dragon. That's about all I can tell you." Brandon snorted in disbelief. "Why should I believe anything you say?" Torrhen challenged. "It's not only me who's here to say it," Aegon responded just as Torrhen and Brandon dropped to one knee. They turned to see a towering figure emerge from behind the tree, his height, size, and the impressive antlers he wore catching their attention. Worn markings that identified him, the old god spoke, "The dragon speaks the truth, and each of you has a role to play. Yours will take you far from here, Brandon Snow. Yours will cause your fellow Northerners to think less of you, Torrhen Stark, and yours will cost your family much blood, Aegon Targaryen. The prince must come, and should you refuse to agree to the terms, then he will not. The north, south, east, and west, everything you cherish, everything you know, will come to an end, and that end will rest upon your shoulders, not mine." With that, the old god moved away, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Torrhen looked to Brandon, who nodded, and together they followed Aegon to his tent. A performance awaited them the next day, one that would feature a public kneeling and a fight between brothers leading to exile. Torrhen would relinquish his crown, only for it to be returned in secret. He would endure his bannerman's scorn, and many years from now, when he faced death, he would question whether his actions had been true. It was a heavy price to pay, but it was one that all three of them were willing to accept. So the next morning, he crossed the trident and knelt before a king, doing so without a shred of doubt. Castle Black. If not for what he and those present had just witnessed, or for Jaime and Arthur catching Jay as he fell, Ned Stark would have been far more concerned about his nephew. Instead, he, Robb, Cregan, the Northern Lords, the men of the Watch, and the members of the Company of the Rose stood witness to the truth of Torrens Stark being revealed. They listened as Aegon read passages from a book, which transformed into a prophecy the company had awaited for centuries. Ned observed as a crown believed to be lost was buried, only for a king to come and claim it 300 years later. When he glanced at Jay and saw the blood trickling from his nose, a sense of urgency swept over him. As Ned looked around, he noticed the worried expressions on Robb's, Cregan's, and the others' faces, and his own anxiety deepened. He rushed to where Arthur and Jaime were laying his nephew on the ground. Will he be all right? He asked, holding his breath. Magic takes a toll, Jaime replied. He'll be well after he's rested. Ned felt a wave of relief wash over him, as if it were a tangible presence. Father, look! Robb exclaimed, pointing urgently. Ned turned to see the blood from Jay's nose trickling down, absorbed by the crown still resting on his head. Is that? Rickard Karstark asked, disbelief evident in his voice. It's glowing, Cregan confirmed. Ned's gaze returned to the crown, now shining brightly. Far below her, Owain sailed with his men, and Dany feared for them all. Even while high on Ellagon's back, with the vast blue sky stretching before her, her focus remained on the ships below. Almost everyone she cared about in the world was preparing for the battles to come: Sandor, Grey Worm, Bonifer, Belwas, and of course, Owain. Aside from her family, who were busy with their own duties, and Missandei, who was to stay on Dragonstone, all of them were aboard the lead ship beneath her. Dany had journeyed part of the way by ship and part by air, spending her nights in her husband's arms and her days soaring through the sky, scouting the lands ahead. She was determined to gather as much information as possible, where there was water, food, and shelter, and where there was none. She wanted Ellagon to be as prepared as possible for whatever lay ahead, whether it was battle or retreat. The more she contemplated each scenario, the less certain she felt about which option was preferable. A retreat might keep her husband safe, as Owain was meant to remain with the ships and help lead the evacuation if necessary. Dany longed for a way to escape the dangers of battle, her heart heavy with fear for those she loved. She wished they could be far away from the chaos. But retreating would mean they were losing, and if they lost, everyone she cared about would be at even greater risk. She had already endured nightmares of losses she knew she couldn't bear. At times, she found herself wishing for the battle ahead rather than the retreat that might follow. Ellagon Conor Ellagon, she said, and the dragon responded, taking her to the small cove she had spotted earlier. In that moment, she needed to feel Owain's arms around her. Though daylight still lingered, she craved that connection now. As Dany flew over the ship, she knew her husband would understand her unspoken message. Ellagon landed gracefully in the cove, and within the hour, Owain had come to collect her in a boat. Soon, she was back on board the Dragon's Breath. The Pinnacle, a wedding gift from her nephew, had become a cherished haven for her and Owain, much appreciated by Sandor and Belwas as well, thanks to the comfort of its cabins. I didn't expect you to return so quickly, Owain said, wrapping her in his arms as the ship set sail. I missed my husband. Besides, we're close enough to Eastwatch now, we'll arrive by tomorrow or perhaps mid-afternoon, she replied, watching him nod with a playful smirk. What? She asked, raising an eyebrow. You take all the fun out of sailing, he teased, and she playfully slapped him on the shoulder as they made their way down to the cabins below. I do not. She protested, pretending to pout. I wanted to impress my wife with my grand declaration of our arrival, but she and her dragon beat me to it, Owain said, still smirking. I'm still fun, she insisted, laughing as he lifted her into the air. His kisses spoke volumes, conveying more than words ever could, reminding her just how much he adored her. That night, she shared a meal with those closest to her, grateful for their presence and the warmth of their connections. Belwas looked rather ridiculous in the extra layers of fur he wore, even here in the warm dining cabin. Sandor couldn't help but tease him about it. Meanwhile, Bonifer appeared lost in thought, and Orain sat much closer to Dany than usual, his hand brushing against hers every so often. She soon realized he only reached for her when she frowned. Worries still weighed heavily on her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to push them away, they lingered until she lay in bed that night. Even then, it was only the distractions of her husband's kisses and touches that brought her solace before they found pleasure in each other, leading her into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, she broke her fast and summoned Ellagon to meet her at a smaller cove. Orain accompanied her to her dragon, ensuring she could fly the rest of the way to Eastwatch. Dany understood the importance of demonstrating their dragon's presence to the men waiting there. It signified protection against the approaching threat. She arrived before they did and heard the cheers as she landed. A smile broke across her face at the sight of Loras, Prince Garin, and the Rhoynish army, ready to fight alongside her and Ellagon if the battle came their way. Her nephew had warned her it would, yet he hadn't ordered the evacuation of the people here, which concerned her given the sheer number of them. Dismounting from Ellagon's back, she took a closer look at her surroundings and saw rows of tents stretching for miles. "Princess, it's good to see you again," Prince Garin said, and Dany was relieved he didn't try to kiss her hand. The coldness of the place made her reluctant to remove her gloves. "You too, Prince Garin." "Ser Loras," she replied, nodding at the young Kingsguard, who appeared far happier than when they last met. "Princess, is Lord Orain to join us?" Loras asked, and Dany smiled at the question. Dany mentioned her husband. "He is. The dragon's breath is not far behind me and should arrive within an hour or two. How are things here?" "We've settled in as well as can be expected. My people aren't used to the cold, but they've adapted well," Prince Garin replied. "And my nephew?" Dany asked, her curiosity piqued. "His Grace stopped here before flying on to Castle Black. He arrived before we did, so we didn't get to speak. We did manage to talk to Prince Tyrion and Prince Oberyn, and both seemed well. But we've heard nothing of Prince Aemon or Princess Sherera," Loras added. Dany could see how much it bothered him that he hadn't seen Jae since arriving. "I'm sure my nephew will join us before the battles to come. As for my aunt and uncle, they have their own parts to play," Dany said, though she wished to see them both and hoped Jae would arrive soon so she could fly on Ellagon to speak with them. "Will you be needing quarters, Princess?" Ser Loras asked. Dany shook her head. "I think my companions and I will be most comfortable on our ship." "You're both welcome to join us," she said, glancing at them and noticing a brief exchange between them before Prince Garin responded. "I think it's best if we stay with my people. We may join you for a meal, though, if that's acceptable." "I'd like that very much," she said, smiling at them before walking over to Ellagon. She instructed her to find somewhere to eat and rest. Orain arrived a little over an hour later. After the dragon's breath had docked, he, Sandor, Belwas, Bonifer, and Grey Worm joined her as she strolled around, taking in more of the camp. The free folk were camped much further from the wall than Prince Garin's men, which brought her some comfort. If the worst came to pass, they and the people of the north would have more than 30,000 men and a dragon between them, the wall, and whatever lay beyond it. It was Sandor who surprisingly broke the silence. "Let's head to the castle and speak with the brothers of the Night's Watch," Dany suggested. She found Cotter Pike and his men were more than happy that she would be staying nearby, or perhaps more accurately, that Ellagon was. After asking for permission, she made her way to the top of the wall. It took her some time to reach it, but the effort proved worthwhile once she arrived. Sherera had already informed her that Regal had refused to cross the wall, and she knew Ellagon felt the same way. If she wanted to see what lay on the other side, this was her only option. As she looked out over the white lands below and the haunted forest in the distance, a chill ran down her spine. The beauty of the landscape was marred by the knowledge of what moved unseen through it. "Let's go back to the ship," Orain said. Dany took his hand, relieved to agree. Castle Black, 301 AC, Oberyn noted that the march through the north had been quite the eye-opener for those accompanying him. The Dornish lords and their men quickly realized that their prince dressed as he did because the conditions demanded it. They had been fortunate not to lose anyone. Some had thought Oberyn exaggerated the cold, only to discover he had downplayed it. His men struggled to light fires, and though Tyrion suggested letting Liggeron do it for them, Oberyn refused. "Your dragon won't always be there for them. They'll learn or they'll freeze," he said. Tyrion nodded in agreement. While it might have sounded harsh to some, Oberyn understood the truth. If they wanted to survive in this harsh environment, they had to adapt. Over the course of their march, they had indeed adapted. By the time they reached Castle Black, he would have matched them against any of the other men who had come this way, barring the Northmen and the Free Folk, of course. Oberyn had enjoyed the journey, spending time with his men, sharing stories as they sat around the fire, and telling them of their homeland. As they approached the challenges ahead, they listened more attentively. The truth about the cold had earned Oberyn even more of their trust. He appreciated Tyrion's company, even if his good nephew had spent as much time in the air as he had on the ground. He and Bronn both shared a sense of longing for Illyria, each missing their own wives. It was no surprise that Tyrion felt this even more acutely, given Arianne's condition. Oberyn did his best to offer reassurance whenever he could. They had stopped to speak with Garland and the Reach Lords, though their visit lasted only a night, and that was spent outside the Night Fort. The relationship between Dorne and the Reach had always been strained, and Doran's actions during the war had only deepened that divide. Still, Garland was as agreeable as Willis, and even though Randall Tarley and Matthias Rowan were a bit prickly, Oberyn was glad to see them there. With the threats marching toward them, they would need all the experience they could gather. Tyrion was delighted to spend time with his aunt, and both Liggeron and Rhaegal seemed pleased to reunite in this unfamiliar land. But for Oberyn, the drive to reach Castle Black and see his nephew again pushed him forward. "Castle Black, my prince," called one of the outriders. Within an hour, Oberyn was riding through the main gate with Tyrion by his side, and for once, not on his dragon's back. When he spotted Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister, along with the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and some unfamiliar men, concern washed over him as he noted the absence of Jay. He quickly dismounted, almost waving away the welcome, and turned to Jaime. "Where is my nephew?" he asked, his voice laced with urgency. "He's resting." "Come, I'll lead you both to him," Jaime replied, smiling at Tyrion, who looked just as pleased to see him as Jaime was. Oberyn asked, "What's happened?" as they climbed the steps to the king's tower. "Jay used the glass candles," Jaime replied. "He wanted to show everyone what we're facing, but that's not what we saw." Relief washed over Oberyn as he noted the absence of worry in Jaime's voice. "What did you see?" Tyrion asked eagerly. "We saw Torrens Stark and the reason he knelt." Gods, Tyrion, Aegon planned his conquest with this in mind. Even back then, he was setting the stage for what's to come, Jaime said, running a hand through his hair. "Jay told us this. He explained everything about Daenerys and the Doom." "Surely, it wasn't that much of a surprise?" Tyrion questioned, but Jaime shook his head. "It's one thing to hear about it, Tyrion, but to see it? I, along with every lord and high-ranking member of the Watch or the Company of the Rose, we all saw the Conqueror as if he were right in front of us. We saw Balerion, Tyrion. We saw Torrens Stark and Brandon Snow, and a plan that was made more than 3 centuries ago. It felt as if we were there, and then we saw." Jaime trailed off, shaking his head. "What?" Tyrion asked, concern creeping into his voice. "You'll see it for yourself. Just don't try to touch it." "Trust me, it's not pleasant," Jaime said with a small shiver as they arrived at Jay's room. Oberyn nodded to Arthur and Jors, who stood guard outside. Inside the room, his nephew lay in bed, eyes closed, looking as peaceful as a babe. Beside him sat both of Jay's cousins. Yet it wasn't them, nor the expression on Jay's face, that captured Oberyn's attention. It was the crown on Jay's head, almost obscured by the brilliant light emanating from it. The light flickered gently, and while they could look at it without squinting or shielding their eyes, it compelled them to turn away. Oberyn pulled away from the crown after a few moments, intrigued. "How is that?" Tyrion asked. Oberyn thought that perhaps, "What is that?" would have been a better question, and it was that inquiry that was answered instead. "The crown of Torrens Stark and the Kings of Winter," Jay's cousin Cregan said. Both Oberyn and Tyrion turned to Jaime, whose nod confirmed the boy's words. Oberyn had known that Jay possessed the crown, but honestly, he had paid it little attention. Compared to all the treasures his nephew had accumulated over the years, a crown worn by a northern king seemed insignificant. Jay owned both the ancestral swords of his house, the Conqueror's crown, Daenerys' journal, glass candles, and even dragons. A crown of iron and bronze felt minor next to all of that. Yet, as he gazed at it, his headache began to intensify, and he found himself questioning his earlier indifference. He started to wonder if this crown, like so many other items Jay had collected, held a significance he hadn't yet grasped. He bid Robb and Cregan to leave when he learned they had kept vigil for several hours. The boys argued until Oberyn firmly told them they needed to rest and eat to maintain their strength. It took his insistence that he would stay by the bed himself for them to finally depart. Once they had gone, Oberyn took a seat beside the bed. When offered warm soup and cider, he accepted gratefully. After finishing both, he turned to Jaime, Tyrion, and Ned Stark, who had joined them after his son and nephew had left. "How long?" he asked. "A day and a half," Jaime replied, a soft smile on his face. "He speaks some at night, just a few mumbled words, well, all but 3. Ghost, Marjorie, Elia," Oberyn said. Ned Stark chuckled and nodded. "Aye, those are the ones." Oberyn gently brushed Jay's hair away from his eyes. He hadn't joined Ned and Jaime when they welcomed Benjen Stark and the Free Folk to Castle Black, so he wasn't surprised when the younger Stark brother approached him just moments after he arrived. Oberyn willingly gave up his seat for Benjen, allowing him to speak to his nephew. A few hours later, it was another uncle who stood over Jay. "A day and a half, you say?" Aemon asked, holding Jay's hand in his own and resting his head against Jay's chest. "Aye, a day and a half," Ned Stark replied. "And it's been like this the entire time?" Aemon inquired, gesturing toward the crown. "It has. A few of us tried to remove it, but it doesn't seem to budge at all," Jaime explained, and Aemon nodded in understanding. "Neither you, nor I, nor even Lord Stark here have the strength to take it from Jay's head. Only one of Stark and Targaryen blood can do so, and aside from Jaehaerys, the only one who shares that blood is Princess Elia," Aemon continued. Oberyn noticed Ned, Benjen, Tyrion, and Jaime exchanging glances. "Her blood is the same as Jay's?" Tyrion asked. Oberyn almost stood up, realizing that Tyrion's question was different. He wasn't suggesting that his grandniece wasn't his nephew's blood relative. "It is. Though it's not quite the same in every aspect, compared to the magic you and I possess, nephew, the young princess is closer to her father than either of us will ever be," Aemon said as he finished his examination and turned to face them. "You're saying that in time she'll be able to do what Jay can?" Jaime asked, and Aemon shook his head. "Perhaps some, if not all. I'm still uncertain how much of it is inherited. We take our blood from our own fathers and mothers. My house traces its lineage back to the 40 of Valyria, and while Tyrion, Shaerra, Daenerys, and I possess a little of this power, but Jaehaerys has always needed more. We are just a sip from this mug," Aemon said, taking a small sip of water. "Jaehaerys is the mug itself." "And Elia?" he asked curiously. "All, most, half, I can't be sure." "More than me, but less than her father," Aemon replied, and Oberyn nodded in understanding. "When will he wake?" Jaime asked, worry etched on his face. Ask him yourself, Eamon said with a broad smile. Just then, Oberyn and everyone in the room turned to see Jay sitting up in bed. He's here, his nephew said ominously. Castle Black, 301 AC, Jaehaerys Targaryen stood on the wall, gazing out over the lands beyond, knowing that he was being watched. His first instinct had been to take to the sky, to fly with Rhaenys and unleash their flames, but he understood the necessity of staying put. When the Night King and his army arrived, he and Rhaenys needed to be present. The men needed to see them, and so did the Night King. If not, the enemy would know his thoughts, and Jay couldn't allow that, not yet. On his head, he wore a cloth that concealed a shining crown, and he could only imagine how ridiculous he must look. Given the smirks he received from Robb, Cregan, his uncles, and Jaime, he felt no need for a mirror to confirm it. It was yet another thing the Night King couldn't see until it was too late, another surprise Jay needed to keep hidden. The gods alone knew what surprises the Night King had in store for him. A part of Jay had considered that perhaps what he had seen was a trick, a feint he should be wary of. In time, he became more certain that it was not. He had glimpsed the Night King's plans, spending moments unraveling the dark threads of fate that loomed ahead. In his mind, he thought about how much more he could have shared if he hadn't been worried about being detected. But he knew he couldn't take that risk. The longer their link lasted, the more likely it was that the Night King would catch a glimpse of his plans. So he had taken what he could and hoped it was enough. Now, he stood, watching and waiting. You sure you don't need to rest? Jaime asked as he moved behind him. I've rested for almost 2 days. I miss being awake, he replied, and Jaime chuckled. I take it your dreams weren't the ones you wished for, then? Jaime inquired. Jay shook his head. I sought ghost. I wished to see them both, to look upon them before. He paused for a moment, composing himself. I didn't want him to see them, to know. Could he? Jaime asked, a note of worry in his voice. I don't think so, but I'm not willing to take the chance. Some of the war to come will be fought elsewhere, Jaime. On a field not of my choosing and not one that truly exists. Jay's eyes held a depth of intrigue as he continued, magic is its own thing. While this battle will occur in this world, it will also need to be fought in that one too. It was hard to explain what he meant, partly because he didn't fully understand it himself and partly because he didn't want the Night King to know that he was aware. Jay's mind was closed to him, as was his family's. Fire and ice magic were two opposing forces that repelled each other. The fact that he possessed both allowed him to do what he did. His family did not share that ability, which meant the Night King couldn't reach them in the same way. Only he, along with a few trusted allies like Jaime, Oberyn, and his uncles Ned and Benjen, knew the full extent of the plans he had made. They could all be vulnerable to the Night King's gaze, so there was only so much he could reveal. He hated it, despised it, and it made him feel dirty inside to keep secrets from those he cared about. Secrets and lies had nearly brought about the end of his world. The house held secrets, choices made long before even the conqueror had drawn breath. Over the years, Jay had done his best to avoid lies and secrets, believing he had succeeded more often than he had failed. Yet now, standing at this point, he found himself having to keep more secrets, something he could only manage if he didn't have to speak a lie as well. Come, we should eat. He won't come tonight, Jaime said, prompting Jay to follow him to the lift. He knew it wouldn't be tonight. They had one more chance before the fight arrived, before he and Rhaenys would be forced to take to the skies. As they reached the bottom of the wall and stepped out of the lift, Jay noticed them, men moving in the darkness, swords already drawn. He sighed and turned to Jorah and Arthur, both of whom had seen the threat too. As the men approached, Jay removed the cloth covering the crown, which shone even more brightly than before. He hadn't even drawn his sword when Arthur had already taken down 2 attackers, and Jorah had dispatched another. The remaining 3 dropped their swords as men surged from the halls. The crown atop Jay's head began to dim once more, and he wrapped the cloth around it again, ignoring the shouts of anger, the men being kicked to the ground, and their pained groans as their former brothers, men of the West, free folk, and Dorne, exacted their revenge. Amidst the chaos, one voice rose above the rest. "What's going on here?" Jaehaerys shouted as he hurried toward them. "These men attacked the king," Jaime replied, his voice laced with anger. "Your Grace, are you harmed?" called a voice. Jay turned to see Ser Simon Santagar, one of the Dornish lords now serving as a brother of the Watch. "I am unhurt," Jay responded. "Lord Commander, I leave these men to you. I suggest you burn their bodies once you're done." His gaze fell upon Black Walder, bleeding out before them. Jay's thoughts drifted back to the faces of his kin, pleading for mercy. He had expected them to fall to the army of the dead, yet it seemed the old gods didn't even want them to survive that long. When he had passed judgment on them outside the twins, he had always kept that in mind. Now, seeing them here, it was clear what their fate would be. Arthur and Jorah had been ready for this moment. He had been ready too. It took nothing more than that, and even his own sword had remained sheathed. The Freys were proving themselves as feckless and impotent as ever. By morning, they would join their father in the 7 hells that were undoubtedly reserved for them. With a nod to Oberyn and to his uncles, who had come to ensure his safety, he offered a grateful glance to Jorah and Arthur. Then he turned to Jaime, and they continued walking toward the common hall. As they sat down to eat, the events of the day quickly faded from memory. Once they finished their meal, calls rang out for a song. Jay consented and spent the next 2 hours singing familiar tunes, including one he had sung in this very hall years before. The words now resonated with deeper meaning as he looked around at his brothers in arms. He wondered if his father had written that song, and if he had known how significant it would become. Sleep eluded him that night, though he remained in his rooms to ensure Arthur and Jorah got their rest. He sat by the fire, writing letters to his wife, his daughter, and all 3 of his sisters. In the Red Keep, he had left letters for those he loved, messages telling them how much they meant to him, meant to be opened only if he fell or many years down the line. The letters he wrote now were ones he hoped they would read upon their arrival. Jay smiled as he gazed into the fire, visions dancing before him, not gifts from Lawler or glimpses of the future, but memories of days long past. He saw himself riding apples over the fields, joy filling his heart. Jay sat near the rock, sharing a moment with Sansa as the sun rose over Blackwater Bay. He recalled sparring with Arya and Lyanna Mormont, laughing as they teamed up to take him down. He remembered holding Elia in his arms while they soared on Rhaenys's back, feeling her head resting against his chest after they had shared a tender moment together. Visions flooded his mind, teaching Martin and Tommen how to handle their lances, showing Walder, Tywin, and Willem how to don their armor. He could see Joanna riding her pony for the first time, her laughter ringing in his ears, and playing with Jon as he lay in his crib. These weren't just fleeting images, they were memories of his time at the Rock, training with Loras and Arthur, having his tears wiped away by Jenna and Ilaria. He thought of the days spent with his cousins, his uncles, Jerian, and the dragons, as well as the moments he cherished with his father. Jay welcomed these visions and memories, yet at the same time, he wished he could let them all fade away. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep, and when he awoke, morning had arrived. He realized he needed fresh air and some time with his sister before what was to come. He dressed and donned his armor, feeling relieved that Jorah had come to his door only after he was ready. With a nod to his Kingsguard, he left the room and walked outside the gates to wait for Rhaenys to land. Ligeron and Sandorix rested nearby, and his sister arrived almost as soon as he did. "I just need some time alone with the dragons, Jorah. We'll be back before the others wake. If anyone asks, there's nothing for them to be concerned about," he said, glancing at his Kingsguard. "Of course, Your Grace," Jorah replied before turning to walk away. Jay almost called him back to express his gratitude for having him by his side, but in the end, he remained silent as he and Rhaenys were joined by Sandorix and Ligeron took to the air almost immediately, their playful spirits evident as the three dragons frolicked together, soaring over the rows of tents and away from the wall. Jay made sure to glance back more than once, ensuring that neither he nor the dragons left the men behind. He wasn't entirely sure why he was drawn to the night fort, but he could sense the joy radiating from the dragons as they spotted Regal on the ground. After spending a little more time in the sky, he landed, allowing his dragons to reunite with the green dragon while he headed toward the main camp. He spoke with Garland, Randall Tarley, Matthias Rowan, and his aunt Sherera, letting her know that it was almost time. Then he climbed back onto Renix's back and flew toward Castle Black once more. "It's time, Jay," Renix said softly as they landed. Jay leaned his head against hers before moving to Sandorix and then to Ligeron. "Be safe, my son. Worry not about your sister or me," he said, stroking the bronze dragon's head. "Father. Your rider, son. Protect your rider above all, even from himself," he replied gently, as Ligeron pledged to do as he was asked. As their two dragons prepared for Aemon and Tyrion to take their places, Jay returned to the keep and called the men to arms. Jors hurried to him, bringing a bowl of porridge, which Jay made sure to eat before he left his side. Soon enough, everyone was assembled: Benjen, Mance, Tormund and Val, Ned, Robb, Cregan, Oberyn, Tyrion, Aemon, and Jaime. Men from the Company of the Rose, the Watch, and the Northern Lords gathered: Glover, the Great and Small John, who had arrived that morning, along with Ricard Karstark and the Lords of the West, Banefort, Marbrand, Crakehall, and Lefford. "The realm has called, and all of you have answered. For what it's worth, every single man and woman here has earned my gratitude. Listen, my friends," Jay began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "What we face is not a battle for crowns, thrones, glory, or fame. It's not even a fight for our own lives. Let's be honest, some of us will fall before this war is over. We fight for those we love, for those who cannot fight for themselves. We fight for our mothers and fathers, our grandmothers and grandfathers, our sisters and brothers. We fight for our husbands and wives, and for our children, both those who are here now and those yet to come. We stand against an enemy that seeks to take everything we hold dear. An enemy that won't stop, that won't offer any terms. An enemy that aims to cast the world into darkness, to bring death to the living, and to replace the fire in our hearts with an icy chill that would freeze us to the bone. This enemy thinks himself invincible, that he has the upper hand, but he could not be more mistaken. I look out at each of you, and I see what he cannot. I see heroes, each and every one of you, with a courage that no fear can diminish. Look to the person beside you. Name me a liar if you can. Look at them and tell me you'd rather have anyone else by your side, guarding your back. I can tell you, I would not want anyone but those who stand here with me today. One day, songs will be sung of the deeds we accomplished today. Songs will celebrate the men and women who looked into the face of death and said, 'No, I will not go quietly into the long night. No, I will not be taken without a fight. Not today.'" As his words rose in intensity, the crowd responded with fervor, chanting, "Not today. Not today. Not today. For those we love. For those we have vowed to protect. For the future of our children and our children's children. Together, we will bring the dawn." Jay declared as he drew his sword, the light shining high into the sky. And so began the attack on the wall in 301 AC. Ned stood atop the wall, just down the line from where Benjen and the Free Folk stood alongside the Night's Watch. To the east, Jaime Lannister commanded the men of the west, while to the west, Oberyn and the Dornish lords prepared for battle. His nephew's stirring speech and the sight of Lightbringer had reignited the courage in those who had begun to falter. He had no doubt that this courage would be essential in the fight ahead. With ice firmly in his grip, Ned was ready for the battle to begin. Ever since he had learned the truth about what Benjen and his nephew had faced at Hardhome, he had understood what he needed to do. Although ice was too large for him to wield comfortably, he had dedicated himself to mastering it. Compared to his experience with a long sword, he felt like a novice, but against the threat approaching them, a long sword would be useless. He had managed to acquire 2 of the 3 essential weapons, dragonglass, dragon steel, and dragonfire. The dragonglass daggers at his hips were meant to complement ice, or at least he hoped they would. Around him, men wielded spears and pikes tipped with Valyrian steel or hardened dragonglass. Some carried axes, maces, and daggers, with a few even more heavily armed. Jaime Lannister held Blackfire, and down in the courtyard below, Arthur had Dawn. Oberyn brandished a Valyrian-bladed spear and a Myrish dagger. His nephew had ensured that Robb and Cregan received daggers as well and had offered one to Ned, but he preferred to keep his Valyrian steel for himself, knowing it was better that others were armed. Nearby, men with bows readied arrows tipped with dragonglass, and some with crossbows prepared bolts made of either dragonglass or Valyrian steel. And, of course, they had the dragons, even if only one could cross the wall. The other 2, along with their riders, remained poised for action. As Ned surveyed the scene, he glanced at the long ropes tied to the wall, hoping they would hold if the moment called for it. Over 10,000 men stood atop the wall, more than had ever been there in its history, according to Prince Aemon. The line of soldiers stretched almost to Oakenshield and Queensgate, extending back behind him to the lift itself. He prayed it would be enough. Turning to Ricard and the Great John, he was interrupted by the sudden blast of the horn. The first blow signaled the return of the Rangers. The second sounded, announcing the arrival of the wildlings. The third blast echoed ominously, warning of the others. The trees, Ned. By the old gods, look to the trees, the Great John urged, and Ned complied. He recalled the first battle of the Trident, where the North, Vale, Riverlands, and Stormlands had united against an army of Crownlanders, Loyalist houses, and Dorne. In the second battle of the Trident, the North and the West had faced off against the Vale and some Riverlanders. But all those men combined would pale in comparison to the army of the dead now marching towards them. Ned watched as giants, creatures, and things he couldn't even identify advanced towards the wall. "Hold," he commanded, just as one of his men released an arrow. Cheers erupted when they heard the roar of a dragon, and Rhaenys took to the sky behind them. Oberyn did his best to rally the troops, urging them to maintain their composure as the horns continued to sound. Each of his men had heard the Black brothers explain the meaning of those horns, so when the third one blew, they all turned to the lands below, witnessing the army advancing towards them. For Oberyn, it was less shocking than it was for those who had never seen such a sight before, though it was still enough to leave a lasting impression. This army was far larger than the one that had attacked them at Hardhome, and the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on them all. There were many more White Walkers in this army than Oberyn had ever seen before. Despite the grim reality ahead, he closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer for his nephew, who had fallen that day. He hoped his nephew had found the peace in the afterlife that had eluded him for so long in this world. He wished that he and the girl Quentyn had told him he loved were together, and that he wouldn't be joining them too soon. When he opened his eyes, he saw Mance, Tormund, and Benjen Stark trying to calm those who hadn't fully grasped the nightmare before them. Oberyn couldn't help but laugh, even with the odds stacked heavily against them. "What's wrong, you fools? Did you think the king was lying about everything he said?" Mance shouted, his voice booming across the gathering. "They may look scary," Tormund chimed in, "but try laying with a giant and then suckling at her breast." His comments sparked a round of loud laughter from the men, easing some of the tension in the air. Oberyn found himself standing beside Ser Simon Sandegar, who seemed almost happy to be fighting alongside Dornishmen once again, despite still wearing black and facing an army at least 3 times their size. Part of Oberyn's relief stemmed from the same reason he was glad to be there, to protect those who couldn't defend themselves and to eliminate the threat before it reached the ones he loved. But perhaps an even bigger motivation was the offer Jay had made to every man of the Night's Watch. "Fight and fight well, and all your crimes are forgiven." I won't restore lands to those who've lost them or titles to those who've had them stripped. But your honor, that you can reclaim, and in doing so, I will grant you your freedom as well. It was a better chance than most of them had ever been given, a real chance. Even if they died, they would die honorably. Ser Simon had told him that if he could have that, then he would welcome death. It's better to be remembered as a hero in one war than as a villain in another, he had said. I hadn't thought. Simon began, his voice shaky. It's better not to think, he said, hearing the cheers around him. Oberyn turned to see Rhaenys and Jae soaring through the air, flying above their heads. That I leave to him, he added proudly. As Rhaenys flew out toward the lands beyond the wall, Oberyn noticed a lone horse galloping ahead of the others, or at least what appeared to be a horse. A figure dismounted and knelt on the ice just as a fierce windstorm seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Oberyn had to shield his eyes from the hail that began to fall. Suddenly, the wall trembled and shook, prompting him to glance nervously at Benjen and Mance. Below them, the storm started to dissipate, and Oberyn, along with the others, stared in disbelief as another wall of ice emerged before them. It towered almost as high and stretched as long as the wall they stood upon. He thought briefly that he could leap from one to the other, but just as that notion crossed his mind, the new wall began to crash against their own. The impact sent some men tumbling off the wall and down to the ground below. The other wall leaned heavily against theirs, and Oberyn could see it more clearly now. To arms! To arms! He shouted. Is that? How is that? Simon stammered, and Oberyn readied his spear, watching as dead men began to ascend stairs made of ice, moving across platforms that mirrored their own. They would have some time before the undead reached them, but reach them they would, and the wall that so many had believed would protect them would offer little defense now. The Half-Hand, the Bridge of Skulls, 301 AC. Oberyn had no idea where the storm had originated or why it had passed so quickly, which only added to his confusion. Yet compared to the sight before him now, he understood the storm's purpose clearly. The gorge was no more, or at least the gap between both sides of it was gone. Instead, it had transformed into a path of ice stretching as far as the eye could see. If the wildlings hadn't already crossed the wall, Qhorin would have been deeply concerned about the dire situation they now faced. If they hadn't already been granted passage through the wall, they would have crossed it without any way to be stopped. That thought offered him only fleeting comfort as he heard the horns sound, 1, 2, 3. For the first time in all his years in the Watch, Qhorin Half-Hand felt a fear that chilled him to his very soul. The distance to safety seemed impossibly far. As he looked at the approaching threat, it became clear to him that they would not make it. Turning to the small band of men he had led into this dire situation, he felt the weight of their fate. They were good men, brothers in arms, and companions he had served with for more years than he cared to remember. I'm sorry, lads, he said, drawing his sword and gazing out at the army of the dead racing toward them. For the Watch, Blaine replied, and Qhorin nodded in agreement. For the Watch, he echoed, along with the 4 other men in their party of 6. Within moments, 2 of them were dead, torn apart right before his eyes. Blaine and the remaining 2 followed shortly after. Qhorin fought with all his might, yet it was a battle he couldn't hope to win, and it didn't last long. It was clear they could have ended him at any moment, but they chose not to. He took down one of the undead, severing its head, and then he struck off the arm of another. But as he exhaled, he felt the icy breath of death chilling his veins. He laughed at the sight before him, the creature in its pale, icy armor and its bright blue eyes. There was something almost absurd about it, or perhaps he just preferred to face death with a smile. The White Walker moved with terrifying speed, effortlessly toying with him. All the skills he had once taken pride in now seemed woefully inadequate. Qhorin might as well have been a novice against the speed, strength, and skill of the creature before him. And when his sword was knocked from his hand, he knew he was outmatched. He laughed loudly. Is that all you've got, you icy bastard? he shouted after being slapped to the ground. His jaw might have been broken, and the words felt more like a thought than any coherent sound. A high-pitched scream pierced the air, and the smell of burning things was the sweetest fragrance he had ever known. Gazing at the fear and anger etched on the White Walker's face, Qhorin surprisingly found a sense of peace. As he watched the white dragon soar overhead, he laughed once more, and then he began to fall. The Bridge of Skulls, 301 AC, Jaehaerys Targaryen. Rhaenys flew swiftly, skimming over the Night King's army. Jae knew he couldn't reveal the truth of his destination until it was too late. Leaving the wall and those he cared about behind to face what lay ahead was a difficult choice, but he had to pray they could hold out until he returned, or retreat if necessary. If the enemy breached the Bridge of Skulls, those who couldn't fight would be at risk, so he had to place his faith in those who could. After flying far enough and unleashing flames upon the dead below, Rhaenys veered away from the north and headed west. They arrived just in time, though not quickly enough to save the Black Brothers who had been swarmed by the army of the dead. Leaving those who were far enough behind to be a non-issue, at least for now, Jae directed Rhaenys toward the gorge. She let her flames rain down on the ice beneath them. As he feared, he directed her to land at a safe distance to avoid danger and quickly climbed down from her back. Hoping he was standing on solid ground, he unsheathed Lightbringer and drove it into the ice, watching as it cracked and began to break. Island Magagon Zyri se Persis, Rhaenys. We bring them the fire, Rhaenys, he said, climbing back onto her back as the ice started to crumble into the depths of the gorge below. It had been too. The ice was too thick for Rhaenys to melt completely, but Jaehaerys knew it didn't extend all the way to the bottom. The magic needed to accomplish that, along with what the Night King was doing at Castle Black, was simply beyond reach. If the Night King had been here instead of there, the wall he was constructing would barely have reached a quarter of the distance he needed. Dracarys, Jaehaerys commanded. Rhaenys unleashed her flames as they soared through the air, incinerating everything beneath them, decaying bodies, ice, and trees alike. When they arrived at the Bridge of Skulls, Jaehaerys saw that a horde had gathered there. The gorge was now impassable, as the ice had crumbled away, and the dead were racing to reach the bridge before him. Fast as they were no match for a dragon. When Rhaenys landed on the other side of the bridge, Jaehaerys climbed down from her back. He sang a brief song, and Rhaenys breathed fire, incinerating any of the dead who managed to cross the bridge before it too collapsed into the gorge. Once he was certain it was safe and none could follow, he rose back into the air within moments. They hurried back toward Castle Black, and Jaehaerys prayed he would arrive in time. However, halfway there, he realized he would not make it. The light was fading and the sky was darkening. He wanted to cry out in anger and frustration, but there was no time for that. The long night had descended, and the war for the dawn had truly begun. Chapter 180, Mr. Night King, Tear Down This Wall, Part 3. Castle Black, 301 AC. Jaime stood in awe, grappling with the surreal scene unfolding before him. If he had lived a different life, what he was witnessing would have been too unbelievable to comprehend. But having met Jae all those years ago and witnessed his remarkable powers, he knew better. The wall of ice materializing where there had been nothing moments before was a testament to the extraordinary. Jaime wasn't the only one struggling to grasp the reality of the moment. He had seen dragons born and watched his king wield a sword of light. Through the glass candle, he had glimpsed the past and present, witnessing a boy command animals as if they were puppets on strings. Tales of stone being sung and bridges appearing from thin air had been shared with him by those he trusted implicitly. So, as he stared at the ice wall forming before him, he maintained his composure while those around him faltered. "To arms! To arms!" he shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Make ready!" The command seemed to cut through the chaos, drawing the attention of the men nearby. One by one, they turned away from the wall and readied their weapons for the impending attack. Jaime scanned the line and spotted Oberyn, Ned, Benjen Stark, Mance Rayder, and Tormund Giantsbane, all mirroring his preparations. As the wall began to collapse onto the ground they stood upon, Jaime moved from his position. He urged those around him to step back. With a resounding crash, one wall of ice collided with another. Jaime hoped to be seen and heard as he shouted down to the men gathered in the courtyard of Castle Black below. "Make ready! Make ready!" he called, grabbing a flaming torch from the wall and waving it high to ensure they could see him, even if they couldn't hear. He had expected the sound of the crashing wall would be enough to spur them into action, that his words would be unnecessary, but the urgency of the moment demanded he take command. Jaime knew they would have started to move as soon as they heard it. Yet, he had to be certain. Standing idle meant they would lose precious time if he and the men on the wall faltered here. As he turned back to take his position among his men, what he saw filled him with worry about that possibility becoming a reality. It was something he hadn't truly considered before. Instead, he had offered the reassurances he believed Jay needed when his king had planned for such an outcome. "We will hold them, Jay. We'll face them, fight them back, and then we'll go home to those we love." He looked out to the lands beyond the wall, where the army now scrambled up what appeared to Jaime like stairs cut into the ice itself. Doubt crept in. He shook those thoughts away and gazed up at the sky. Jay and Renix were out there somewhere and would soon attack these creatures from behind. They needed to hold them here, as long as possible, while his king and his dragon took care of the rest. Hold your fire until you're certain you can't miss. Ready the fireballs. Hold steady. They're just dead fools. Look, there's no meat on their bones. Even the cannibals wouldn't get a decent meal off any of them, har. Jaime heard the voices around him. The last one was Tormund Giantsbane's. He admired how the man could laugh even in such dire circumstances. His own men looked to him as he unsheathed Blackfire and stepped closer to the edge. Below them, the army of dead men climbed the ice stairs and moved along platforms made of ice. As he observed the structure, he thought they could have benefited from that kind of ingenuity when the wall was built. It was a fleeting thought. If their side of the wall had been as easy to climb as this one, it would be just as easy to descend. The last thing they wanted was to make it easy for the dead approaching them. Jaime's gaze shifted to the ropes hanging down the side of the wall, ropes that might prove crucial should the worst come to pass. Prepare for the worst, Jaime thought, knowing they might have to climb down to find safety. Release the scythe. A booming voice commanded. Jaime felt a wave of relief. His thoughts had turned dark, and it was far better to focus on the scythe's potential than on whether the dead could descend the ropes. Cheers erupted around him, likely from the Black brothers stationed above, alongside his men. They had explained the wall's defenses to him: catapults, trebuchets, large stones, balls of pitch, and, of course, the scythe. Some of the coin that he and Jay had sent to the Watch over the years had gone toward repairing those defenses. The scythe, however, had needed no repairs. It was a massive steel blade held in place by enormous chains. Jaime didn't know how it had been constructed or how it functioned, but he was about to find out the latter. As the scythe began to swing down, ice broke off the wall, and he, along with every man who could see it, held his breath. It gained momentum, and by the time it was just feet away from the edge of the opposite wall, it was moving swiftly, until it suddenly wasn't. Jaime had never witnessed anything like it. The ice seemed to move to stop the blade, and instead of crashing into the edge of the other wall, the scythe smashed into ice that hadn't existed just moments before. The impact sent vibrations through the air, causing some of the dead to tumble from where they had been climbing the ice wall. Some fell, but far fewer than would have if the scythe had worked as intended. "Here they come!" A voice shouted, and Jaime heard the arrows begin to fly. Balls of pitch were lit and dropped, fireballs raining down on the dead below and igniting some of them. Arrows struck true, and more of the undead fell, truly dead this time. Yet still, they advanced, their losses seeming inconsequential as they absorbed everything aimed, fired, or dropped their way, pressing on relentlessly. Jaime barely had a moment to breathe when he heard a scream. A man had been grabbed from somewhere to his left, the sound of his cry echoing as he was yanked from the wall and dragged down to the dead below. Spears and shields. Swordsmen, make ready. Hold them back, hold them back. Jaime shouted, his eyes fixed on the undead that were now just feet away, with even more advancing further down. He knew that some of his men were beyond his reach, at least for now. Blackfire felt like an extension of his arm, the Valyrian steel sword as if it had been forged just for him. He swung it with little technique, facing enemies that were unworthy of the blade or his skill, and that thought would have angered him on another day. This sword deserved a better fight, he mused, as he severed the head of another foe. He silently thanked the gods for the sword's lightness and the sharpness of its edge, as he felled more undead than he could count. Beside him, others fought with equal ferocity and bravery, but then, suddenly, the world went dark. Jaime heard the screams of men who had ceased their fighting, for daylight had vanished and night had fallen. Aside from the flickering flames of a few nearby torches, there was no light to be found, and some men's courage wavered in that moment. If it hadn't been for the roar of the dragon and the sight of flames engulfing the dead below as Rhaenys flew from west to east, they might have been lost. But the sight of Lightbringer in Jay's hand, glowing brilliantly, instilled both courage and the realization of just how much courage would be needed. There are too many of them. A voice shouted. Where did they come from? Another called out. Jaime swung Blackfire, catching a glimmer of light from the corner of his eye. Jay had turned Rhaenys around and was making another sweep. Fear not, for our king is with us. He fights alongside us and brings the light. Jaime shouted, hoping his words would be enough to restore their resolve. His men's courage and faith had inspired him, just as it had the first time he met a boy in a sparring yard all those years ago. It was 301 AC at Castle Black. Robb Stark. When they arrived at Castle Black, he was shocked by the dire conditions. Later, when he spoke with his uncle Benjen, he learned that, as bad as things were now, they had been even worse before Jay's visit years earlier. The North had always been poor, but at least it had done everything it could for the Night's Watch. The South, on the other hand, had offered little support, aside from a few noble houses, until his cousin stepped in. Robb had refused to sleep in one of the few available rooms. Instead, he gave his place up to one of the other lords. He wanted to be among the men, and while he knew his father would be proud of his decision, that wasn't his true motivation. Many years before, his father had told him that it was important for a lord to know those who served him. During his time fostering with Lord Wyman, Robb was always amazed by how many names his good father knew. From cooks to maids, to every single one of his guards, Wyman knew them all. On the ride to the wall, and since their arrival, Robb had made it his mission to learn the names and stories of each and every one of his men. He had formed friendships, not just among the men of Winterfell, but also with Cregan's men, Lord Glovers, the Karstarks, and the Umbers when they arrived. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in a warm room on a soft bed while they huddled in their tents around the fires. Now, as he sensed their courage begin to falter and their resolve weaken at the sound of something hitting the wall, he felt grateful for his choice. Make ready. Make ready. He shouted when he spotted a flaming torch being waved atop the wall. You heard Lord Stark. Form up. The fight is upon us. Will come to us all soon enough, Cregan shouted, adding emphasis to his words. Aye, there are men up there who need killing, and if the gods are good, we'll be fighting them soon enough. They're next for Goat's Bane. The small John called out, his spirited declaration eliciting some nervous laughter from the men on the ground. Jay had delivered a rousing speech, and Robb knew it had sparked a courage in the men they might not have realized they possessed. But courage was a finite resource, it wasn't limitless. Understanding that they were about to face dead men who would not back down was a different beast compared to knowing they were up against an army that lived and breathed. Many of the men with him had fought during the war for the one true king, demonstrating bravery and loyalty. Yet this war was unlike the last, for the enemy they now faced needed to be completely wiped out, surrender was not an option. What do you think is going on up there? Cregan asked, worry creeping into his voice, speaking so quietly that only the Small John and Jory Castle could hear him. The fight is here, my lord, Jory replied, and both he and Cregan turned to the more experienced man. That was Lord Jaime who swung that torch, I'd stake my oath on it. Other than your father, your uncle, or my own, there are few men more experienced than he. That was no panic. I don't know what hit the wall, but the fight is here, my lord, and we best be ready for it, Jory said, and Rob's gaze drifted to the top of the wall. He cursed its height, wishing he could see clearly, yet felt a strange comfort in its presence. Form up, to arms, he commanded, moving to the group he was in charge of and signaling for Cregan and the Small John to do the same. As they had ridden together and spent time with the men, he had listened intently to those older and wiser than himself. They shared little gems of wisdom and tricks to keep themselves sharp and ready for whatever lay ahead. But not so close that they might fall off. After encountering the men of the Company of the Rose and learning who they were, as well as understanding their purpose through the visions in the glass candles, he listened to their tales more intently than most. These men had fought all their lives, and even his father, now facing his fourth war, was far less experienced than they were. He and Cregan had gathered around the fire with Brandon and Torrent Snow, soaking in their stories, hoping they had listened well. The waiting, Lord Rob, that's what feels like the worst of it. But it's not the worst, not by a long shot, Torrent Snow said. What's the worst of it, Commander? Rob asked, curiosity piqued. When the waiting is over, Brandon Snow replied, earning nods from the other members of the company. As he glanced over at the Company of the Rose, watching their bowmen readying their bows and their spearmen preparing their weapons, he wondered if the waiting was truly at an end. Just then, he felt gray wind move through the yard, coming to his side, while dusk did the same for Cregan. Scanning the yard, he soon spotted Frost standing by Val, who was organizing the free folk as best as they could be organized. Then, the howls rang out across the yard, all three wolves howling simultaneously, and Rob watched in horror as day turned to night. This was impossible. It was still early, wasn't it? How could it be so dark? Where was the sun? His thoughts spiraled, threatening to overwhelm him, until he felt the familiar brush of fur against his hand. He reached down to stroke Grey Wind's neck, and almost instantly, a calm washed over him, one he hadn't felt just moments before. Now, he understood what he had to do. Following Grey Wind, he trusted his wolf to see what he could not. Moments later, he found himself in a hall, the surroundings coming back into focus. Sheathing his sword, Rob reached out and grabbed two. Rob ran back into the yard, torches in hand. As he expected, the darkness had stolen their discipline, and it took both waving the torches and shouting orders to restore some semblance of order. To me. Gather the torches and ensure each group has some. Hurry, the night is upon us, and who are we to, he began, but then he heard the noises. The sound came from the gates, and a wave of fear washed over Rob. Had they somehow been outflanked? Were the dead already past the wall, surrounding them? He was about to order an attack when he heard Cregan shout, "They're allies." Look up. Rob did, and what he saw took his breath away. A dragon's flames illuminated Castle Black before fading into the distance. Then came more lights, dimmer and less powerful, but closer. The sound of men marching toward them was unmistakable. Rob wasn't the only one drawn to the gate. Along the way, he saw men of the north, warriors of the Company of the Rose, and men and women of the free folk moving as he was. What he witnessed was something he would remember for the rest of his life, a line of fire advancing toward them, made up of men wielding flaming swords and spears. Among them were women and men dressed in red as well. As he looked closer, he realized it wasn't flames they carried, but light, a light very similar to that which shone from his brother's sword. Who the hell are they? Small John asked, as if Rob had the answer. The fiery hand, Torrent Snow replied, his voice filled with disbelief. When Robb gave the order to open the gates, the men marched into the yard. They formed up, turning to face the wall, their spears and swords held high. He couldn't tell how many there were, but he guessed there were close to 1,000. Among them, there must have been around 50 women. These were red priests and priestesses, and Robb could only name 2 of them. "Our God has sent us to offer our aid in the war for the dawn," Melisandre said. As she spoke, the warriors of the fiery hand struck their spears against the ground, and the sound echoed throughout the courtyard. "The prince leads, and we follow. Our spears, our swords, and the light he gives us, we join to your own," Thuras declared. Before Robb could respond, the priests and priestesses began to chant. He watched in awe as the darkness that had enveloped the yard transformed into light, with torches igniting all around him. Castle Black, 301 AC, Arthur Dayne found himself positioned further back, as his king had instructed him and Jaehaerys. They stood among the men who couldn't fit into the courtyard, alongside Prince Aemon and Prince Tyrion. It wasn't where Arthur wanted to be, but he had given his oath to Jae that he wouldn't leave Rhaenys's side without finding him first. Arthur had asked how he would locate Jae amid the chaos of battle, and then felt foolish for doing so. He hadn't even noticed the owl that followed him, nor the one that trailed after Jaehaerys. He should have expected it, given the words Jae had spoken while they made their way to the wall. Jae's fears were not for himself, but for those who fought for him. His concerns were not about the battle ahead, but for the families of those who might not see the end of it. Arthur had done his best to reassure him of the necessity of their fight, and he hoped that his words had made an impact. Knowing Jae as he did, Arthur should have anticipated that Jae would always find a way to keep track of those he cared about. He would know Tyrion and Aemon through the dragons, and his cousins and uncle through the wolves, while others, like Jaime, would remain in his thoughts. Oberyn likely had someone watching their every move. If he hadn't spent so much time with Jae and asked so many questions about him over the years, he might have worried that he was stretching himself too thin. Magic always came with a cost, be it blood, fatigue, or something else entirely. There was always a price to pay. Warging, however, was different, or so Jae had explained. True, it had its own cost, but over time, Jae had learned to manage it and had paid it tenfold. He had told Arthur that the cost was so small it barely mattered at all. What was that? Jaehaerys asked as Arthur felt the ground tremble beneath them. The wall, something's happened, Tyrion said, moving toward Ligeron. We do as we're bid, nephew. Our fight is not there, not yet, Aemon said, halting Tyrion's steps. We don't know if it's held. Jaime, Jae. Tyrion's voice was laced with worry. You think the dragons wouldn't know if Jae was harmed? Or that they wouldn't feel his worry for your brother? Our place is here, nephew. For now, at least, Aemon replied, and Tyrion nodded. Jaehaerys moved to calm the other men. The presence of one of the King's Guard was enough to ease their fears, and while most would have preferred to see someone else, they were relieved that it was Jaehaerys who approached them. The wait felt like an eternity, and then Arthur stood, open-mouthed, as the sun seemed to vanish, plunging them into darkness. Fire the torches, Aemon said, reacting faster than Arthur could. Fire the torches. Arthur shouted, his voice urging the men into action. Around them, the men lit their torches, and the light returned. Yet, as they turned their gaze to the wall in the distance, they could see nothing. What the? How? Jaehaerys asked, worry etched on his face. There. Look. Tyrion said, almost with excitement, and Arthur turned to see flames flickering along the top of the wall, clearly rising from within. From a dragon, Lightbringer illuminated the scene, allowing them to see the wall once more. They watched for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only moments. The wall was first aglow with 1 or 2 torches, and then they noticed a line of fire moving towards it. What's that? Bronn asked, and even Aemon seemed at a loss for words this time. My prince, I suggest we fly, just you and I, close enough to see, but only to observe, Arthur proposed to Tyrion, who glanced at Aemon as if seeking permission. Sir Arthur is right, Tyrion. Fly and see, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary. If the situation becomes dire, have Ligeron roar, and Ser Jorah, Lord Bronn, and I will lead the men forward, Aemon instructed, and Tyrion nodded in agreement. As they approached, Arthur sensed that the dragon shared his eagerness, and Tyrion's, to get closer to the wall and ensure Jae and the others were unharmed. He won't fly too close, Sir Arthur, but we'll be able to get a look at those below, and hopefully, those on top of the wall as well, Tyrion said as they climbed onto Ligeron's back, and the dragon soared into the sky. The flight to the wall was swift, and as they neared it, they could see that, aside from the darkness, much less daunting now, thanks to the Red Priests, who must have been the source of the line of fire, they were safe at the base of the wall. Ligeron ascended higher, and Tyrion had to guide the dragon in a wide circle to fly alongside the wall instead of directly towards it. He felt the dragon's anger and sensed Tyrion's growing fears as they observed the chaos above. A fierce battle raged on top of the wall, and Arthur couldn't fathom how the dead had managed to reach such heights. For now, they were being held back, but the defenders faced overwhelming numbers. Suddenly, he felt the dragon turn and fly away from the wall, and he heard Tyrion angrily shout at Ligeron. Arthur looked back at the wall, where Rhaenys was unleashing flames in the distance. He could sense that Jae was keeping the fire low, ensuring it only consumed the dead below the wall. When they finally landed back at their camp, he listened to Tyrion as he continued to argue with the dragon, but to no avail. Ligeron had made up his mind to return to the camp, and nothing Tyrion said could change that. Frustration bubbled within the prince as they walked back to where Jorah, Aemon, and Bronn awaited them. Tyrion stomped across the ground, his anger palpable. "My prince?" Aemon asked, concern evident in his voice. "Our king wishes us here, Sir Arthur, and his bond with his son is still strong," Tyrion replied, his frustration evident. In that moment, Arthur understood what had transpired, and a smile crept onto his face, one that Tyrion thankfully didn't notice. If he had, he might have misinterpreted the reason behind it. Jae was following his own plan, just as he had promised, and that plan required them all to play their parts. The dragons that couldn't fly over the wall were needed here. If the wall fell and the dead crossed into their territory, something that now seemed increasingly likely to Arthur, then all the dragons would have a role to play. For now, only Rhaenys could engage. Like a bowman who hadn't yet found his range, their time would come soon enough, though Arthur hoped it wouldn't have to. Castle Black, 301 ASOIAF Mance. There were more of them, many more, and he should have anticipated it. The attack at Hardhome had been larger than he ever imagined, but compared to this, it felt like nothing more than a skirmish. They just kept coming, and neither the dragon's flames nor all the weapons they brought to bear seemed to slow them down. This assault was also more strategic. It was clear that both sides had learned lessons from the battle at Hardhome. Mance had yet to encounter a single White Walker. Instead, it was only the dead that his dragonglass could put to rest. But with each one he dispatched, another took its place, and they were rapidly losing men. He had already witnessed comrades being pulled from the wall, only to plummet to their deaths on the other side. None had risen yet, but if the dragon's flames, or their own, didn't get to them, they surely would. Mance had to shout, making it clear that those who fell on their side of the wall couldn't be left up here. Push the bodies over the edge. Better they rise down there than up here. Some had ignored him, dismissing his orders because of who he was, while others looked ready to skewer him where he stood. It was only when Prince Oberyn echoed his words that they finally listened. Men began pushing the bodies of friends over the edge, and Mance could see the pain in their faces. It hurt him just as much to do the same with men he'd known for years, men whose families waited for their return but would never see them again. And it wasn't just men, he had witnessed more spearwives fall today than he had in years. Yet he had no time to mourn. "How many of them are there?" Tormund shouted, his axe cleaving through a white that came too close to the wall. What does it matter? They're here and need to be stopped. We can count them later, Oberyn replied. Tormund laughed, and together they took down 2 more. The dragon had soared past more times than Mance could count, and she and the king had unleashed flame upon flame, yet the dead kept coming. They had set the haunted forest ablaze, but the flames were extinguished just as quickly, and Mance knew that's where the enemy was. Jae seemed to know it too, spending as much time over the trees as he did over the wall, perhaps trying to draw them out. But this time, the dead were smarter. It made him wonder if the attack was. The battle on Hardhome had been less about capturing the free folk and incorporating them into the army of the dead, and more about testing their defenses. The Night King was challenging them, observing how they responded and what tactics they employed. In his many conversations with Jae, Mance had listened intently as the young king shared everything he had learned, the lessons he had noted, and how they would aid them when the real fight began. As Mance felt a sharp cut across his shoulder and dropped to one knee, he wondered how much of this was true for the Night King as well. Mance! Tormund shouted, cutting down whites to reach him and help him back to his feet. Just a flesh wound, old friend. It's not even as bad as that time with. The dragon roared loudly, its sound echoing for miles, and Mance glanced at Tormund with concern. Jae's plans were known only to him, while they had formed their own strategies, and he had shared very little about his. One thing he had implied, however, was clear. He looked at Tormund, who nodded, and with a shout, Tormund ordered the retreat. Not a complete withdrawal, there was no way they would abandon the top of the wall just yet, but a retreat from the fiercest fighting. Make for cover, fall back. Tormund shouted, but only some of their men responded. Run, you fools! He called out loudly to those who hadn't moved. Flames erupted behind him, and he hoped it was only the dead who were caught in the blaze. Rhaenys was laying down fire on the top of the wall for the first time, and while Mance felt a sense of relief seeing so many of their foes reduced to ash, he feared what it meant that Jae had needed to resort to such measures. Until now, Jae had focused on targeting those lower down, trying to limit the number of enemies reaching the top. The fact that he now had to strike at those near the top indicated they were in serious danger of being overrun. As the fires burned out, they made their way back to the edge of the wall, and he looked down in disbelief. He had expected to see even more of them climbing up the icy structure conjured by the Night King. Mance was certain that the battle they were about to face would be far more challenging than the one they had endured so far. As he glanced down and around at the others, listening to the cheers that erupted, he wished he could join in their celebration. Below them, there were no dead men, none at all. Not even those who would have fallen victim to the dragon's flames had made it to the top. They, too, were gone. While some men around him cheered and celebrated, Mance gazed out toward the haunted forest and spoke his thoughts aloud. This is not over, he said softly. Beyond the wall, 301 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen stood at the Bridge of Skulls, feeling that stopping the dead should have felt like a significant achievement. Perhaps it would have, if night hadn't fallen before he reached Castle Black. Maybe he would have felt differently if the night had been just that, a simple night, but knowing the truth made his actions at the Bridge of Skulls seem almost futile. Deep down, he understood it wasn't pointless, he had done what he could. Had he not acted, this war would have already claimed far more lives than he could bear to imagine. Rhaenys had reassured him when he needed it most, instilling in him the determination to do what was necessary. They had taken to the skies, and she unleashed her flames while he tried not to dwell on what the dead were climbing upon. He had drawn Lightbringer to illuminate the night and bring hope to those defending the wall, while Rhaenys had unleashed her fire, striving to limit the horrors they faced. She was powerful, far stronger than either her brother or their aunt's dragons. Not only could she fly longer, but her flames were fiercer and could be sustained longer as well. Whether this strength stemmed from her own nature or their bond, he could not say. In the end, it mattered little either way. It was what it was, and it would be needed today. They flew past the second wall of ice, and despite himself, Jaehaerys was impressed. In all the times he had imagined how the Night King would seek to cross the wall, this method hadn't crossed his mind even once. It was simple and effective. On the first pass, it was clear that Rhaenys's flames wouldn't be enough to melt the ice or bring it down. Just like with the dragonglass, the Night King had found a way to fix a problem before it became one, somehow hardening the ice. "You seem impressed by him," Rhaenys remarked with a hint of a snort. "I can respect him, Ray. Respect rather than dismissal. It doesn't mean I like it, but it does mean I won't underestimate him." "Where is he?" she asked as they made another pass along the wall, her flames taking out some of the undead who hadn't yet begun their climb to the top. "I believe he's over there," he said, pointing toward the haunted forest. "We should go there and set it aflame," Rhaenys suggested, glancing at the dead who were climbing and now battling those defending the wall. "One more pass," Jaehaerys said, hoping to ensure they weren't overrun. After laying down their flames once more, they turned away from the wall and headed out over the haunted forest. Once again, he had Rhaenys unleash her fire, and he watched as the trees beneath them burned. If there were dead below, they would burn too, and he knew they were there somewhere. Closing his eyes, he tried to reach out to any animal he could find below and was stunned to discover none. There was no life, not even a mouse had managed to survive in the Night King's path, and he was sure that he was the reason for that. He knew the Night King was a ward too, he had felt it when he had done so himself. But unlike Jaehaerys, the Night King couldn't control the living and could only briefly see through their eyes. Just as Jaehaerys would sometimes find the doors closed to him, the Night King. Jaehaerys understood the stakes all too well. In his case, the animals he intended to warg into would remain alive. He could force them down, but doing so would kill them, and a living mind was no place for a dead one. "Ray, move," Jay said, sensing the spear before he even saw it. He watched as it flew harmlessly by. "Dracarys," he commanded, and his sister unleashed even more flames. Only one more spear came his way, and he realized that the Night King was holding back, waiting for an unmissable target. By retaliating with flames, he was draining some of the Night King's army and power. The Night King didn't want to lose too much of either, especially not those closest to him. The flames that should have consumed the forest were extinguished far too quickly. It was clear that this was the Night King's doing, not the natural chill of the land. "Ligeron, Jay," Rhaenys said. Jay took them higher into the air than before, spotting Tyrion and Ligeron where they shouldn't be. The ice spears didn't truly concern him, he trusted the Valyrian chain mail to protect the dragons. But he didn't want the Night King to know that just yet. While he could dodge the spears, Ligeron might not be so fortunate. He intended to let the Night King waste more of his power on futile attempts. It was better for him to be weak than strong, so for now, he needed to play the part of a mummer when it came to those spears. "Go, and go now. This is not where you should be, and Tyrion is in danger if you stay," he urged through his bond with Ligeron. He could sense his son's anger at the thought of his rider being at risk. "Is he truly in danger?" Rhaenys asked, once Ligeron had heeded the warning and was safely away from the wall. "I don't know, Ray. We have the freedom to move on either side of the wall, but I fear what might happen." "If Ligeron got too close," Jaehaerys said, sensing his sister's rising fears. They turned back toward the wall, unleashing their flames once more as they flew alongside each other, noting how few of the dead were emerging from the trees. It was during their return flight that Jaehaerys felt a shift in the air, realizing he had been somewhat deceived. The Night King had been watching them, taking notes on their movements. Determined to act, he willed Rhaenys to unleash a roar and targeted those nearest the top of the wall for the first time. How had so many gotten there? Where had they come from? Was this part of the Night King's plan? These questions raced through his mind, unanswered. As Rhaenys scorched those who had just breached the wall, he hoped that his earlier warning had been heeded. By the time she finished, none remained. The second wall was as empty as the first, and Jaehaerys glanced toward the trees, swearing he saw the Night King standing there, watching. "You need to rest, to eat," he urged, guiding her to fly over the wall and land outside Castle Black. I can rest, for now." "You can rest," he insisted, and Rhaenys reluctantly agreed. He wasn't sure how long they had been fighting or how many hours they had spent in the air. He couldn't tell if it was still day or if night had truly fallen. All he knew was that the battle was far from over, and the Night King showed no signs of easing his relentless assault. His sister needed to recuperate, and he had to find out about their losses and check on those he cared about. Meanwhile, at Castle Black in 301 AC, Oberyn was feeling the weight of exhaustion. The enemy just kept coming, with no signs of letting up. Around him, men fell, simply overwhelmed by the relentless tide. No sooner had they stopped one foe than another would take its place, and then another, and another. Daemon had nearly fallen, and Anders too would have if not for Ser Simon, whose dragonblast dagger was now lodged in the eye of what appeared to be one of the free folk from Hardhome. He actually slowed his spear when he saw the creature that had once been a man. The thought that Quentin could be out there among those abominations raced through his mind, nearly costing him his own life. When Rhaenys roared, he ordered the men back and watched as the dragon's flames accomplished in an instant what all the men on the wall could not. Once the fires died down, he moved back to the edge, stunned to see that no wights were advancing toward them. "Where have they gone?" Ser Simon asked, worry evident in his voice. "I have no idea," he replied, momentarily at a loss for words. Jaime summoned him, and leaving Daemon in charge, he made his way to where Jaime, Mance, Tormund, Ned, Benjen Stark, and the Great John were huddled together, discussing something while pointing toward the trees of the haunted forest. He assumed they knew more than he did, but as he joined them and listened to their conversation, it became clear they were just as confused. "They must have melted back into the forest," the Great John suggested. "Why?" Tormund asked. "They were winning. The dragon, when Jay brought her to the top and unleashed her flames, he sent a message, didn't he?" Benjen said. "The same message he's been sending all day, Benjen." "Much as I'd like to give our nephew credit for this, it wasn't him," Ned Stark replied, and Oberyn found himself agreeing completely. "We can ask him, he'll be here soon, no doubt," Jaime said. Oberyn glanced from the hand of the king to the other side of the wall, the side of the living. "He and Rhaenys are on our side," he asked, which confused Tormund for a moment. "Have you not been watching? Who else's side would the dragon rider be on?" Tormund said angrily. "He meant our side of the wall, Tormund," Mance clarified, as Tormund shifted his gaze between him and the others. "Then why the hell didn't he just say that?" "Damn kneelers!" Tormund exclaimed. Jay grumbled, "They flew over us not long after laying down the flames. I'd say we'll see him soon. Until then, we wait and do our duty." After a few moments, Jaime said, "Let's move back to join our men." It took another hour for Jay to arrive atop the wall, Arthur by his side, clearly indicating that he had flown to see his uncles and the Kingsguard first. Oberyn hurried to greet them as soon as they stepped out of the lift. He felt a wave of relief seeing that his nephew not only looked unharmed but seemed relaxed, far more so than Oberyn himself felt. "It's good to see you well, Uncle," Jay said, a small smile brightening his face. "You too, nephew." "And my niece?" Oberyn asked, glancing to the south of the wall. "She's resting and eating with Ligeron and Sandorix," Jay replied, gesturing for Oberyn to follow him and Arthur. Jaime arrived just before the two Stark brothers, followed closely by Mance, Tormund, and the others. Jay encouraged them all to follow as he walked the length of the wall, speaking to and patting some of the men on the back as he passed. He remained silent with Oberyn and the others until they reached the other end of the wall. Once there, he stopped and addressed them all. "We need to rotate the men. You all need to eat and sleep. I won't listen to a single one of you say that you're not tired or hungry and that you wish to fight on, Jay asserted, his voice and expression leaving no room for argument. It'll take most of the night to change over, and I'll be staying here until it's done. None of you, except for Arthur, is to do the same. Am I clear? Your Grace, perhaps. Ned began, but was quickly silenced by Jay's look. I can do things with Lightbringer that are just as effective as Renix's flames, and once he sees me on the wall, he won't attack, Jay added, his determination evident. Oberyn nodded in agreement. Oberyn looked at him curiously. How can you be so sure, Your Grace? He asked, using the title since there were too many men nearby for him to do otherwise. I'm sure, Uncle, Jay replied. The how of it I can't explain. Tonight was a test, and he's found out some of what he wanted to know. The next attack will be larger and more focused. Take the night to eat, rest, and be ready. Oberyn could see that while the others were reluctant, they were also grateful. He couldn't even begin to guess how long they had been fighting or what hour of the day, or night, it was. When he finally left the wall and took the lift to the bottom, he welcomed the warmth of the food. Even more, he welcomed the heat of the fire and the blankets he wrapped around himself as he lay down to sleep, dreaming of Ilaria and a much different bed. When he woke the next morning, or what he assumed was morning, he felt refreshed and ready for the day, or night, ahead. After breaking his fast with Ned and Jaime, he learned that his nephew had indeed spent the night atop the wall. Oberyn listened to tales of Jay walking the line with Lightbringer in hand and how those below, looking up, spoke of their king doing just as they were. It became clear to him then, and he understood the truth of why Jay had stayed on the wall that night. It wasn't just to keep the Night King at bay, it was for the men's morale. They needed to see that after spending hours flying on a dragon and slaying more whites than any of them, he was still willing to walk the line and guard the wall rather than retreat to his bed. By sending the men who had fought on the wall to rest and eat, he demonstrated that he was not willing to ask any more of them than he was of himself. More than their rest, that was his true intent. Castle Black, 301 AC, Benjen Stark. He had convinced her not to go to the top of the wall, not once, but twice now. The first time had been when he, Mance, and Tormund had pretty much rallied everyone against her, insisting they needed someone to lead the free folk on the ground. The second time he approached her was much easier. He leaned in close and whispered that he wanted to spend the night in her arms, and that Jay was confident no battles were imminent. It didn't matter to him which of those two convinced her, all he cared about was that she ate with him, drank with him, and when he looked at her, Val seemed just as eager for their bed as he was. Mance and some of the others felt the same, and if he was being honest, most of the group did too, except for Tormund. Despite being told to eat and rest, Tormund only agreed to the first part. Once he had his fill, he headed straight for the ale. Neither Val nor Mance could persuade him to stop. I may be dead by morning, and if I'm to meet my gods, I'll do so after a night of drinking. If there were a bear nearby, I'd be after a night of fun too, Har, Tormund declared, earning a laugh from Benjen as he shook his head. As far as attitudes went, it wasn't the worst to have, and some shared in Tormund's sentiment. Benjen noticed some of the free folk from outside Queen's Crown doing the same. He and Val exchanged goodnights and made their way to the rooms he had been given. He had offered to sleep in a tent, but his nephew, brother, and even Mance insisted he couldn't do that. Now, he was grateful. The fire was already crackling in the hearth, warming the room as they entered. The atmosphere was perfect for what Val had in mind as she shed her furs, taking Benjen's breath away as she always did. Are you just going to stand there and gawk at me, Benjen Stark? I may not be a bear, but for once, Tormund actually had a good idea. It would be a shame for us not to enjoy ourselves when we can, she teased, and the wink she gave him was nearly enough to make him hard. She stood there, as naked as the day she was born. How he managed to last as long as he did, only the gods knew. She had drawn him in, ready for him, her legs wrapping around his back as if to ensure he wasn't going anywhere. There was no real need for that, but he welcomed the sensation nonetheless. When he finally reached his peak, it was to the sound of her own pleasure. Her beaming smile and deep breaths as he caught his own breath proved that she had enjoyed it just as much as he had. He felt her snuggle up against him, and while he longed to talk and hear her voice, fatigue overwhelmed him. "What hour is it?" he asked, worry creeping in as he woke and jumped from his bed sometime later. "I have no way to tell. This damned darkness doesn't let up, Ben-Jen. Night, day, morning, or evening, I can't tell," Val replied, her worry and annoyance clear as she began to dress. "It'll be dawn soon," he said, wrapping his arms around her, trying to ignore the chill creeping in now that the fire had gone out. "How can you?" she started, but he silenced her with a kiss. "Because Jay will bring the dawn," he said softly moments later, and she nodded. Feeling the cold, Ben-Jen dressed quickly, and in his haste, he didn't notice that Val hadn't drunk her moon tea. As they walked through the courtyard to the common hall for breakfast, his attention was diverted, so he missed the moment she poured it onto the ground, a small smile on her face as she did so. He also didn't notice how she didn't argue when he prepared to head back to the top of the wall. Val simply kissed his cheek, and Tormund couldn't resist teasing him as they took the lift. "I see you found your own bear, Har," Tormund said with a loud laugh, and for once, Ben-Jen simply joined in. Castle Black, 301 AC, Cregan Stark stood at the base of the wall, a thrill of excitement coursing through him. He was eager to ascend with his men, to finally witness the events that had unfolded above, a vantage point he could never grasp from the ground. He longed to take part in the fight they had come for, to wield his sword, spear, and daggers gifted to him for this very moment. Though he understood their role as reserves, Cregan couldn't shake the desire to join the fray. The news that he would be manning the wall alongside Robb, the Small John, Harrion, and his uncle Arthur, only fueled his determination. Yet, as he caught glimpses of the men they were replacing, doubt crept in. The sight of fewer soldiers descending from the top than had ascended sent a chill through him. According to Uncle Ned, 10,000 had gone up, but Cregan wagered there were barely 7,000 returning. As he walked beside Robb toward Jay and Lightbringer, snippets of conversations echoed in his mind, faint whispers of a wall, dead men climbing, and relentless waves of attack. The fearsome images of dragon flames and chilling blue eyes haunted him. Yet, upon reaching the top, he found little evidence of the battle that had transpired. Then, the darkness of the night was pierced by the glow of his cousin's sword and the spears wielded by members of the Fiery Hand. "By the old gods," the Small John murmured from in front of them. Cregan moved to see what had captured his attention. "How is such a thing possible?" Robb questioned, and soon Cregan found himself sharing that sentiment. Before them stood a wall of ice, leaning against their own, stretching more than 100 yards. It resembled a siege tower, not for the living, but for the dead to stand upon. But this one was far larger and more imposing in its scale, constructed entirely from ice. Cregan couldn't help but wonder how something like this had even been built. When had it been created? And how had it been transported? He was deep in thought when he heard Jay's voice, bringing him back to the present. "It's magical," Jay explained. "What I can bring forth from stone, the Night King can conjure from ice. Just as I can create an image and bring it to life, so can he. I've made bridges, reforged a burned tower, and rebuilt one that had long since fallen into ruin. Don't dwell on the how, cousin. I understand it, yet I still can't fully explain it. Just know that it's possible, and you should be prepared to see more of such wonders." Cregan nodded in understanding. "The light from your sword, your grace, is it duller?" Small John asked, his worry evident. "Aye, for now. With them here, I need not let it shine brightly," Jay replied, gesturing toward the Fiery Hand. "Will there be an attack, your grace?" Robb inquired, his tone more anxious than eager. Cregan noticed. "No, I doubt it," Jay said, gazing out over the lands beyond the wall. "Go and ready your men. Stand with them and let them see you as you did below. I'll speak to as many of them as I can before night falls. Is it night, Your Grace? Small John asked, shaking his head in confusion. Does it look like day to you? Jay chuckled, which soon turned into a hearty laugh. Aye, fair enough, Small John replied before asking about Ghost. Where is your wolf, Your Grace? With my wife and daughter. I considered bringing him here. Jay trailed off, lost in thought before continuing a moment later, would prefer him by my side. Both my cousins can attest to the comfort we feel when they're with us, Small John. Then why not bring him, Your Grace? Small John asked. Jay smiled. It comforts me even just to know he's close. He's there with my wife and daughter, Jay said, his voice filled with conviction. Knowing he's by their side while I can't be, I realize they have no more loyal and capable protector than him, even more so than any of the Kingsguard, including the Bold himself. He reached out and touched Small John on the shoulder. Think of your own wife, Small John. If fear threatens to take the fight from you, remember her. Know that I'll do everything I can to bring you back to her, to bring all of you back to those you love. Small John nodded, and as Jay moved away, his uncle Arthur followed closely behind. They walked along the wall, joined by Robb, Harrion, and Small John. Cregan watched as Jay stopped to speak with some of the men, sharing laughs with others. Northmen, free folk, Dornishmen, men of the West, the Fiery Hand, and the Black Brothers, all were included in his warmth. Jay engaged with them as if they were equals, never looking down on anyone. Later, as Cregan stood with his own men, gazing out at the lands below, he heard the singing. The quiet of the night was interrupted by familiar melodies, and he knew who had started them. Their night passed without incident, and throughout it all, Jay walked with his sword glinting in the moonlight, asking the men about their families and the ones they loved. He expressed his gratitude for their presence and shared how proud he was to know them. As the night wore on, Cregan was surprised to hear Jay call the men by name, names they had only mentioned to him earlier that evening. I don't know how he does it, Harrion said, watching Jay interact with some of the men from Dorne. Does what? Cregan asked, curious. Remember us all and treat us like friends, not just men he can order into a fight, Harrion replied. Cregan turned to see Jay laughing as a man recounted a story about growing up in Planky. The town, with its proximity to the sea and the warmth of the sun, had offered no preparation for this moment. We find our true friends on the battlefield, Cregan said, glancing at Harrion. My uncle Ned told me and Robb that as we rode from Winterfell, he continued. He said war reveals a man's true nature, whether he's brave or a coward, true or false. When faced with the likelihood of death, it shows what lies within his heart. Harrion looked at him, contemplating Cregan's words. Do you think the king sees us as his true friends? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Are we not? Cregan replied, offering a small nod and a bigger smile. The only way Cregan knew how long they had truly been on guard atop the wall was when the lift arrived, bringing his uncles, Lord Jaime, Lord Rickard, the Great John, and Prince Oberyn, along with some leaders of the Free Folk. For a few moments, they made arrangements to replace some of their more fatigued men, though many would remain to fight if the battle came today. Cregan, Robb, Harrion, and Small John would not stay, and despite his protests, Jay was being sent to rest. Cregan found it amusing that the King of the Seven Kingdoms was, for all intents and purposes, being sent to bed. As he shared a laugh about this with Robb, he suddenly felt it, the cold wind forcing him to pull his furs tighter around him. They're coming, a voice called out. Cregan turned to the trees and saw shapes moving in the dark, but then they vanished completely. How the storm had descended upon them so quickly was a mystery. One moment, it was cold and dark, the next, he was pelted by what felt like hail, or at least, he prayed it was hail, as visibility vanished. By instinct, he drew his sword, but despite hearing what seemed to be voices carried by the wind, he couldn't discern who they belonged to or what they were saying. In the darkness, Cregan suddenly spotted a light that shone so brightly he had to shield his eyes. Cregan. Cregan. Are you hurt? Are you injured? Harrion shouted as he helped Cregan back to his feet. I'm unharmed. What happened? Cregan asked, glancing around to see men moving, yet no fighting was taking place. Harrion, what happened? He inquired, worry creeping into his voice. There was a storm, and then there wasn't. The king and your uncle have taken to the sky. We're to go back down below, Harrion explained, but Cregan looked at him in disbelief. Go back below? The fight is here, Harrion. They're coming. My uncles, Rob? He asked anxiously. They're well. The fight's not here, Cregan. Not for now, at least. The king and his dragon have gone to where the fight is, Harrion replied, glancing off to the east. Eastwatch. The fight is at Eastwatch. Chapter 181, Mr. Night King, Tear Down This Wall, Part 4. Eastwatch, 301 AC. Loras knew he would have preferred to spend all his time with Garen, but there were duties he had to fulfill during his stay. Their forces were primarily composed of the Rhoynish, free folk, and some men from the north, but soldiers from the Crownlands and the Vale had also joined them, along with the princess's own men. Loras had been tasked with organizing all these forces as best he could. Although the princess and Prince Garen held more authority, Loras had faced the dead, and that experience earned him their respect. He had made multiple trips to the evacuation points to ensure that a system was in place for quick and efficient loading of the ships, should the need arise. This responsibility had consumed most of his time, more so than arranging the men at Eastwatch. The free folk were not accustomed to organization and had little interest in following orders. Countless times, he had invoked Jay's name and spoken of Hardhome to motivate them. Now, Loras found himself losing patience with a large group of free folk who hadn't been at Hardhome and were the most resistant to following his lead. Ask those who were there, he urged them, his voice rising with frustration. Ask them what they witnessed and then act accordingly. I saw thousands fall only to rise again, men, women, children, it didn't matter. You see an army standing between you and the wall, and we will fight for you. But if they come, you need to play your part. A voice called out, these kneelers are trying to tell us what to do. Aye, they are, Loras replied sharply. Why do you think that is? Why do you think these ships are here? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. The king wishes for your safety, and to achieve that, you may need to leave. The easier that process goes, the more lives will be saved. It's not kneeling to follow orders, it's only kneeling if that's all you ever do. His words were met with some nods and shouts of agreement. It was night by the time Loras returned to his camp, where Garen was busy among the water wizards, preparing them for the fight ahead. Loras made his way to the princess's camp and the dragon's breath. He encountered no obstacles or challenges until he reached the ship itself. There, the Unsullied barred his entry until they received approval from Strong Belwas. Not even his identity allowed him to board unchecked, and he appreciated the princess's caution. Once on deck, he was escorted down to the largest cabin, just in time for the evening meal. Daenerys sat laughing at something Orain had said, while Belwas took his seat next to the Hound, neglecting to announce Loras's arrival. Loras chuckled to himself, amused at how absorbed the princess was in her husband's conversation, oblivious to his presence. Ser Loras, all is well? Daenerys asked when Orain noticed him and whispered in her ear. It is. I just wanted to check that you've had no issues settling in, he replied. Daenerys laughed and shook her head. Other than the cold, no. Some of the free folk have come by from time to time, mainly to ensure that Ellagon is still here and hasn't left them, I believe. If I were less confident, I might feel miffed that they care more for my dragon than for me, she said, her smile still bright. Have you been to the evacuation point? Orain asked as he was invited to take a seat. I have, and I spoke with some of the more disagreeable members of the free folk. I explained a few things to them, and they seem to have taken it to heart, Loras said, and Orain nodded. They're a most unusual people, are they not? Daenerys inquired. They follow their own rules, Princess, Loras replied. He paused, then continued in a poor imitation of an older man's voice, the freedom to make my own choices. It's about mistakes, Loras said, as Princess Daenerys, Orain, the Hound, and Belwas looked at him in confusion. It was something Mance Rayder told His Grace and me when we were beyond the wall. He hoped to clear up their confusion, but instead, it only led to more questions. He was a man of the watch, was he not? Orain asked, and Loras nodded in response. Yes, he was. A number of years ago, he was ranging beyond the wall and got injured. A free folk woman saved his life, or so he told His Grace and me. His cloak had been damaged, and the woman sewed a piece of cloth onto it to repair it. But since she had no black cloth, she used red. When he got back to the Shadow Tower, he was ordered to remove the red from his cloak, and for Mance, that was the day he left the Night's Watch. Loras continued as they all listened intently. He left over some cloth. Orain asked with a chuckle. Loras opened his mouth to respond, but the Hound spoke first. He owed the woman a debt, and wearing the cloth was to honor her, the Hound said gruffly. Aye, that was at the heart of it. That, and the notion that even in such a simple matter, he was given no freedom to make a choice, to make his own mistake, Loras added, and Daenerys nodded in understanding. From there, he united the free folk under his leadership and prepared to bring them past the wall, Loras concluded. He sounds like a good man, and I know my nephew thinks very highly of him, Daenerys remarked, glancing at Loras to see if he felt the same. We've fought and bled alongside him, Princess. Him and the free folk. I know some think of them as wildlings and savages, but in all the time they've been south of the wall, they've held true to their word. There are far too many in the south who have not, Loras said, shaking his head. And I think I'm done. I did not come to lecture or discuss matters like this, but simply to check that all was well with everyone here. He stood up. Sit and eat with us. Come, Ser Loras, let's talk about more pleasant things, Daenerys said, looking directly at him. Thank the gods for that. I was about to go find some other people to eat with, the Hound replied, prompting laughter around the table. No, you weren't, you lying brute. We're the only ones who brought chicken, Daenerys shot back, and soon Loras was laughing along with them as he enjoyed his meal. They were soon joined by Grey Worm and Ser Bonifer, but as the food arrived, Loras began to feel like an outsider. The gathering at the princess's table felt less like a court and more like a family. Although they welcomed him to join, it was clear he was not, and would never be, a part of that family. Yet, he didn't mind too much. He had his own family, along with bonds that felt just as strong as those shared by the people at the table, Jay and Marjorie, Jaime and Daisy, Joy and Sansa, and those who resided in the Red Keep. They were as much his family as his blood relatives or as Daenerys's companions. The next morning, Garren returned. Loras had spent the night alone and had missed him terribly. Garren's first words confirmed that he had felt the same, admitting that while his absence had been necessary, it hadn't been welcomed. They broke their fast and spent the early part of the day riding through the camp, going over drills with the men. Just after midday, they made their way to the castle at Eastwatch to speak with Cotter Pike. As they prepared for lunch, a chill filled the air. Loras, Garren, and all the men in the courtyard looked up as day suddenly turned to night. Eastwatch, 301 AC. Since their arrival, Ellagon had required more and more of Daenerys's attention. The dragon didn't like being so close to the wall and had made its lair in caves cut into the nearby cliffs. Every morning and most evenings, Daenerys was forced to fly with her. It was only after they spent time together that Ellagon would finally settle. Calm as she flew back to her lair to rest. It warmed her heart that she felt such a protective instinct for him, but it also worried her that she felt the need to be so. Aside from her dragon's reluctance to be there, Daenerys had almost enjoyed her time since arriving. She had observed the Hound, Belwas, Bonifer, and Grey Worm taking turns teaching the men of the Royne and others how to fight against the challenges that lay ahead. Each of her own men had been trained by Ser Arthur and Jay, and she knew that Ser Loras had also faced the dead and was now instructing others. When she wasn't watching the men train or riding on her dragon's back, Daenerys spent her time with the young girls and women of the free folk, who had embraced her almost from the moment they first laid eyes on her. Whether it was due to her dragon, Jay, or as some had said because her hair resembled the glow of the moon, she didn't mind. She simply enjoyed their company, and they seemed to enjoy hers as well. Her nights were a different story, and perhaps they were the true reason she found herself enjoying this place. They would eat, laugh, joke, share stories, and even listen to songs. Daenerys discovered that both Belwas and Bonifer had decent singing voices, even if their songs varied greatly. Belwas's were often funny and bawdy, while Bonifer's tended to be more somber. Once the night came to a close, she and Orain would retire to their cabin and spend the night in each other's arms. She found that her desire to be close to her husband wasn't limited to the night. She smiled as she watched him dress. They had been on deck when she felt a strong urge to be with him, a need he gladly fulfilled. With a simple look and a nod of her head, he took her hand, and they hurried down to their cabin. Once there, much to her delight, the rushing came to an end. As she lay in bed and watched him get ready, she felt content and happy, more than she had in a long time. It was a feeling beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. But that sense of joy was fleeting as she noticed Orain move to the window, an odd expression on his face. "Orain?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. "It can't be." "It's too early," he replied, his tone more confused than concerned. At least, that was what she hoped. She quickly rose from the bed, wrapping a sheet around herself. "What can't be?" she pressed, just as she heard Ellagon roar. "Orain." She dressed as swiftly as possible, with her husband helping her into her armor instead of her usual clothing. Grey Worm and Bonifer rushed to their door, checking to ensure they were both safe. Ellagon's roars grew louder, announcing the dragon's approach. Once they left the cabin, Dany wasted no time walking up on deck and stepping off the ship. Ellagon landed almost simultaneously with her feet touching the ground. Dany hurried to her dragon, offering reassurances. "I'm here, my love." "I'm here," she said softly, as Ellagon's eyes seemed to scan her every inch. She gently stroked the dragon's snout. Around them, panic erupted, and in that moment, Dany understood what she needed to do. She climbed onto Ellagon's back, soon joined by Orain and the others who had hurried after her, all gathered around as she spoke. "I must fly and show them that we're here for them. Go amongst the men, have them light torches and form up in case they're needed. Go. I'll be on Ellagon's back. Go." With that, the dragon took to the air. Dany lost count of how many times she had Ellagon fly and roar, releasing flames not in anger, but in a desperate attempt to provide much-needed light. Yet, the dragon's presence seemed to have a calming effect. When people saw that they were there, using their flames not against an enemy, but against the darkness itself, it made a difference. Below them, Orain, Sandor, and Belwas. Bonifer and Grey Worm were joined by Ser Loras and Prince Garin as they worked to calm the fears of the people. Once Dany saw that the initial panic had subsided, she soared higher into the sky. Though Ellagon wouldn't fly past the wall, she ventured closer than she had before. The frustrating part was that, in the darkness, she could barely see the wall, save for a few flickering torches that had been lit. Unable to see beyond it, she decided to signal the men at the castle, showing them that she and Ellagon were in the air if needed. After that, they flew back over the camp and headed toward the evacuation point. It took Dany longer to calm these people down, and she even had to land to reassure them. She ordered them to light their torches and informed them that the men ahead had already formed up. When they asked if they were under attack, she assured them they were not, hoping she was right. Only when she was certain they were calm did she fly back to the main camp, seeking out Owain and those she cared about. Ellagon was reluctant to let her climb down from his back, forcing Dany to spend some time soothing him while Owain waited to speak with her. "What do we know?" she asked her husband once Ellagon finally allowed her to step away. That one moment it was day, and the next it was night, Owain replied, his frustration evident. "We need to go to the wall. We must see over it and find out if we're under attack or not," she insisted. Owain looked at her with concern. "We must. We're in the dark here, in more ways than one," she added, and he nodded in agreement. Bonifer, Sandor, and Owain all climbed onto Ellagon's back after Dany instructed Grey Worm and Belwas to attend to the men. They would need calm heads if her fears were confirmed. Belwas might act a fool at times, but he was anything but when it came to battle. As for Grey Worm, he was perhaps the calmest person she knew. It didn't take them long to reach the castle at Eastwatch. Dany was not surprised to find both Ser Loras and Prince Garin had arrived as well, both men likely having the same idea she had. "Princess, you and your men?" Ser Loras asked. "We're safe and well, Ser. What about the Rhoynish?" she inquired, glancing at Prince Garin. He nodded, reassuring her that they were also unharmed. "Ellagon and I flew to the evacuation point. I believe we've calmed the free folk down for now. But what is this?" she pressed, looking for answers. "The long night has fallen, Princess. This is how things will be until the Night King is defeated," Prince Garin replied, his voice revealing concern, though he seemed less fearful than she and the others. Dany turned to Owain and Bonifer, both of whom stared at the prince with worried expressions. The long night was a legend, a myth, something they had never truly prepared for. How could anyone prepare for a night that seemed eternal? When she glanced at Sandor, her worry deepened. For once, he wore an expression that showed his true concerns. "We'll speak more on this later. For now, we need to see beyond the wall," she stated, and the group nodded in agreement. Ser Loras went off in search of the commander at Eastwatch, only to return with the news that Cotter Pike was already ahead of them, having made his way to the top of the wall. Bonifer and Owain grabbed torches as Dany reached out and squeezed Sandor's hand when he stepped back from the open flame. They made their way up the long, winding staircase, and by the time they reached the top, Dany was out of breath, dreading the long walk back down. Cotter Pike stood in a covered area that overlooked the other side of the wall. "Princess, it's good to see you." "To see you all safe," Cotter said, relief evident in his voice. Dany asked him if his own men had suffered any accidents or harm, feeling a wave of relief when he assured her they had not. "I wish I could tell you more than I'm about to. But I can't see anything out there. Not that there's nothing, mind you. It's just this," Cotter said, waving his hands into the darkness. "There's not even a moon to offer any light," Ser Loras added as he moved to the edge and peered over the abyss. "Can your ravens fly in this?" Dany asked, receiving a nod from one of the Black brothers. "Send word to His Grace at Castle Black and ask for advice on how to proceed," she instructed. "At once, Princess," the man replied before hurrying away to fulfill her command. "All we can do is prepare and make sure the torches and fires are kept lit," Dany continued. "We'll order the men to form up, and your horns will need to be our call to arms, Commander," she said to Cotter. "I'll post my best lookouts up here, men behind men, just in case they're needed. Each will carry a horn, and I suggest that if you hear even one blow on it, you make ready," Cotter said, his voice trembling. "I thought one blow was for rangers?" Ser Loras inquired. "There are no rangers out there, lad. In this darkness, we may not get a chance to blow the horn more than once." "Best we accept that for now," Cotter replied, and Dany understood the logic in his words. 3 blows of the horn signaled others, but how could anyone see them when visibility was limited to just a few feet? She left the rotation of their forces to Prince Garin, Ser Loras, Bonifer, and Sandor. Until now, the men had rested at night, with only those on watch remaining awake. With the threat of an attack looming at any moment, that approach was no longer feasible. They needed a large force ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. A half-and-half division was suggested, and she entrusted those more experienced than herself to see it done. Orain had held her tightly in their bed that night, or day, or whatever it was, their room bathed in darkness except for the single candle she insisted on keeping lit. How many hours had passed since they'd last seen the sun? It was hard to tell, but in the enveloping darkness, time felt suspended. The night felt endless, a darkness thick with terrors. Melisandre had often said, "The night is dark and full of terrors," and Dany found that sentiment more true than ever. She stood beside her dragon, Ellagon, gently stroking her snout to soothe her after a long rest. Suddenly, the dragon let out a trill that caught Dany off guard, followed by cheers that echoed around her. Curious about the source of the commotion, she turned and was met with a familiar sight, Eastwatch. In 301 AC, Jaehaerys Targaryen experienced a wave of disbelief wash over him. For a fleeting moment, he thought it was a trick of the mind. It wasn't until he confirmed that no attack was imminent that he felt certain. With that assurance, he had to act quickly. He exchanged brief words with his uncles and Jaime before he and Arthur hurried to the lift, descending to the ground below. Once they reached the courtyard of Castle Black, time was of the essence. After sending a message to Jorah to stay with Tyrion and Aemon, Jaehaerys and Arthur climbed onto Rhaenys's back and set off for Eastwatch. As they flew, Jaehaerys warged into the birds he had left near Dany's ship and Loras's tents. He discovered that both the birds and his aunt and friend were now positioned atop the wall. Through the owl's eyes, he scanned the surrounding darkness, seeing farther than anyone atop the wall could, yet still finding nothing. He knew they were out there, waiting and watching, and he could only hope he would arrive before they did. The forces at Eastwatch were ready, led by Prince Garin, a warrior known for his prowess. However, this war was unlike any other, and even he had been taken aback by the Night King's capabilities thus far. They flew along the southern side of the wall, simply because that was where they found themselves. If he had believed he would find what he needed on the northern side, he would have gone there. But he sensed that what was about to unfold at Eastwatch would be different somehow. The king wasn't planning to attack with a wall of ice, and the army of the dead wouldn't be lined up as they had been at Castle Black. Flying over the haunted forest and unleashing flames wouldn't yield the same results, and he couldn't even be certain that the army of the dead was hiding among the trees. He drew Lightbringer from its sheath, more to signal those below that he had arrived than to see them, though it helped with that as well. Since raising the sword high while flying through the darkness from the Bridge of Skulls to Castle Black, a sense of clarity had settled over him. Lightbringer was meant to end the Night King and bring the dawn, but it was more than that. It was a symbol, something for others to rally around, a beacon in the darkness, and beacons needed to be seen. "Down there, Jay," Arthur said from behind him, pointing to a wide-open space. "Aye, down there," Jay replied, instructing Rhaenys to land. No sooner had they touched down than they were nearly surrounded by people, free folk, Rhoynish, some men from the Vale, and those from the Crownlands. But mostly, it was Prince Garin's men. Once Rhaenys confirmed that Jay was safe, he took to the air again, searching for Ellagon. Jay spoke briefly to those around them, confirming that he, Arthur, and Rhaenys would not be leaving Eastwatch anytime soon. Whether it was his words or the sight of Lightbringer in his hands, the effect was the same. Where there had been worry and doubt just moments earlier, there was now hope and resolve. "We should head to the wall," he said, and Arthur nodded. The two of them walked slowly but purposefully toward the castle and the stairway leading to the top of the wall. If it were another time, if he hadn't been concerned about causing panic with their hurried movements, he would have rushed. But he knew he needed to project a sense of calm and maintain an air of composure, so he took his time. As they strolled through the courtyard, Dany, Loras, Orain, and Prince Garin were all waiting for him. Cotter Pike reached him first. "Eastwatch is yours, your grace." "We're mighty pleased to have you here," Cotter said, a hint of a smile on his face. "Would that I were here for better reasons, Commander," he replied with a small nod. "Can you gather your seconds and arrange a place where we can all meet and speak?" "At once, your grace." "My solar should be large enough," Cotter responded, quickly moving away from the yard. Jay offered Dany his warmest smile as he approached her, embracing her and kissing her softly on the cheek. "It's good to see you, Dany," he said gently. "You too, Jay." "Are you staying?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Though I wish I were not," he admitted, feeling her shiver against him. "Loras," he said with a nod as he stepped away from Dany, wishing he could embrace his friend as well. "Your grace," Loras replied, a genuine smile of relief spreading across his face. "Orain," he greeted. "Your grace," Orain responded. "Prince Garin, if you'll walk with me," Jay said. "I've organized a meeting with the commander. I'll explain what's going on once we get there." "Of course, your grace," Garin replied, nodding in agreement. When they reached the commander's quarters, Jay declined the offer of food or drink but insisted that Arthur partake in both. He sheathed Lightbringer, took a seat, and waited for the others to settle in before he began to speak. "I stopped an attack at the Bridge of Skulls before destroying the bridge itself. While I was doing that, the Night King and his army attacked Castle Black. They were held back by the forces there until I arrived, and then they retreated. They're here or will be soon, and here I'll await them," he explained, but Dany interrupted him. "The dark, Jay, how is it so dark?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The long night. Darkness always comes before the dawn, Dany. Just as Lightbringer brings the light, the Night King ushers in darkness. Until he falls, darkness is what we will know," Jay said, reaching out to touch his aunt's hand and offering her a reassuring squeeze. "So the tales are true," Prince Garin remarked. Jay turned to him and nodded. "All the tales are true. Myths and legends only became that way because the truth was forgotten over time. The children of the forest, the others, wargs, greenseers, dragon dreamers, and even water wizards, all of them are stories now. But I am a warg, a greenseer, a dragon dreamer. I've met the children of the forest and fought against the others. The truth is simple, the Night King will cast the world into darkness unless he is stopped, and we, will stop him," Jay declared as firmly as he could. From the moment he discovered his true self, Jay had struggled to find his voice. At times, his worries and doubts had influenced not only his thoughts but also his words and actions. He still grappled with them, still worried, still filled with doubt. Yet he had learned that people looked to him and to Marjorie. They looked to their king and queen, hoping they would provide courage when none could be found, certainty when they were unsure, and the resolve to act without hesitation. Through Ghost, he sensed Marjorie's worry for him, for Elia, for Garland, Loras, and for everyone they cared about, both those present and those who were not. He knew she was frightened and longed for comfort, yet she hid her feelings and offered solace to the men, women, and children of King's Landing. She was their beacon, their light, speaking to them with a queen's voice. The least he could do was speak to those with him with a king's voice. And so he did, and the more he spoke. The more I spoke, the more that voice became my own, Jay thought. We will be attacked. How and when, I don't know. But we must be prepared for anything. Jay looked around as Cotter nodded in agreement, while Garin glanced at him, waiting for direction. What would you have us do, Your Grace? Loras asked, his determination evident. For the next hour, Jay laid out his orders, and once he finished, he found himself alone with Arthur and Dany as the others set to work. He closed his eyes and focused on the visions he often experienced, seeing Jaime on top of the wall with Oberyn, gazing out at what felt like an empty land. His uncle Ned was resting nearby, while Benjen spent time with his cousins Val, Tormund, and Mance, all of them laughing at some tall tale Tormund was spinning. Tyrion and Aemon gathered around a fire with Jors and Bronn, while Sandorix and Ligeron rested not far from them. The wolves were out hunting, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him as he noticed their hackles weren't raised in the slightest. Jay, Dany called, shaking him gently. He opened his eyes to see her looking at him with concern. "When was the last time you slept?" she asked, her hand softly touching his cheek. "I'm not." "Don't tell me you're not tired. You just dozed off. Go get some rest. It won't do any of us any good if you..." Suddenly, the sound of the horn rang out, once, twice, and then a third time. It didn't matter whether he needed rest, there would be none to be found this night. "He's here," Jay said, jumping to his feet. Battle of Eastwatch, 301 AC, below him, Cotter Pike had met with the king to organize the defenses and prepare for the impending battle. Meanwhile, the top of the wall was left under his command. He stood there with nearly 2,000 men, some of whom wouldn't take orders from him. Yet they would look to him for leadership, and though he hoped nothing would happen until braver men than he led the charge, he knew the time had come. He couldn't quite grasp what he was leading them against. The tales of the others had always seemed like distant legends to him, he had never witnessed the horror some claimed to have seen. But he knew Stannis Baratheon, a man not given to exaggeration or flights of fancy. Borkas, as the steward of Eastwatch, had dealt most with the wildlings. Though he wouldn't trust one of them any further than he could throw them, he had never detected lies in their eyes when they spoke of Hardhome. Many labeled them as liars and worse. He had been guilty of the latter, just like any man in a black cloak, but he had never believed them to be liars, unless you were asking about their clan, of course. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and shook off such thoughts as he moved toward the fire to warm himself before returning to the edge of the wall. He couldn't explain why he felt it, nor how he knew it was a genuine feeling and not just his nerves playing tricks on him. All he knew was that something was out there. He stepped to the edge of the wall and looked out, then shouted, "Daeron, fire an arrow." "What at, Borkas?" Daeron asked, confusion in his voice. "Fire the damn arrow into the air so I can see what's out there, for goodness sake." Borkas snapped, his agitation clear. He watched the arrow soar, but the light it produced revealed little. However, it was enough to prompt him to order more arrows to be fired, this time aimed down below, not into the sky. As they struck their targets, he grabbed the horn from his waist and began to blow. For the next hour, he ordered men to release arrows while below them, on the northern side of the wall, the dead things burned yet continued to advance. Borkas felt a heavy certainty that he was destined to die here. Though that had always been a possibility, as pardon from the watch was not something he expected. He had hoped that when his time came, it would be many years from now. As he stood there, he heard Cotter Pike's voice behind him. Turning to look, he saw Ser Arthur Dayne by his side and breathed a huge sigh of relief. Deep down, he still felt the weight of impending death. Today might still be that day, but at least it would only be his own life he was responsible for. If he were to face his gods, it would be only his life that he would have lost. Dany had been nearly dragged away from the wall by Bonifer and Grey Worm. The two men were listening to her nephew's orders instead of her own, and that annoyed her greatly. So much so that she barely registered Jay's words until she reached Ellagon. She recalled that she was to mount her dragon and be ready to fly if Rhaenys called for her, only if Rhaenys called for her. "I don't know the plan here, only that this is where the fight is, Dany. Give me time to understand it before you and Ellagon are part of it, I beg of you," Jay said as Grey Worm and Bonifer arrived to usher her from the castle. As they moved through the camp, chaos surrounded them, organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Men and women ran as if in a panic, yet the more she observed, the more she sensed a purpose behind their frantic movements. A guard had formed around her, her unsullied, Ser Bonifer, and Grey Worm were all there in case she came under attack before she could take to the sky. This had been a concession she made to Sandor and Orain once Sandor had insisted upon it. She hadn't even argued with him as she normally would have. Knowing he saw her as a little sister and worried about her safety to the point of neglecting his own was enough to sway her agreement. "Fire, princess," she heard Grey Worm say. She looked into the distance to see torches being lit and flaming arrows soaring through the night sky. Flying high in the sky, Dany looked around, anxiety creeping in. "Where are they firing?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "Beyond the wall," Ser Bonifer replied, his tone serious. Dany nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. "You must mount your dragon, princess," he urged, concern evident in his voice. "I will, Bon," she said, using the name she'd heard her mother call him back when they visited the glass candles. She knew it brought him joy when she did. With determination, she climbed up Ellagon's wing, settling into the saddle once she reached his back. Reaching behind her, she opened the pack she had tied to the saddle before setting out on this journey north. She pulled out a belt, fastening it around her waist, and glanced at the twin daggers it held. Even though she would be on her dragon's back, she understood that things could go wrong. If Orain had his way, she'd be taking Sandor with her, even in the air. But while the saddle was secure for flying with passengers, it wouldn't be practical if she needed to unleash Ellagon's flames. No, once she took to the skies, her safety would rely solely on her and Ellagon. Should she need to land in one of the many spots she had scouted as safe, she knew she might still have to defend herself. She untied her bow and slung it over her back, along with a quiver full of dragonglass-dipped arrows. Now, she, Bonifer, Grey Worm, and Ellagon waited for the call. Meanwhile, Arthur moved alongside Loras and the prince's men, ensuring they were properly armed as they lined up on top of the wall. Most of them held spears and shields, each tipped with dragonglass. The Rhoynish shields featured a spike, serving both offensive and defensive purposes, and the incorporation of dragonglass into their design was a clever adaptation. Observing it now, Arthur saw the benefits and felt it should be something their own men utilized in the future. But first, they needed to ensure that there was a future to be had. After they had readied the men and formed them up, Arthur gave Loras permission to go find the prince. He then moved over to where Cotter Pike and the other members of the watch were standing. They had maybe 2,000 men on top of the wall, far fewer than Jay had mentioned were at Castle Black. However, the king had assured him that the attack here would be different. Arthur silently thanked the gods for that. The thought of seeing a wall of ice forming in front of him and its potential impact on the men's morale was not something he wanted to dwell on. "Your Grace," Cotter said, pointing towards a light in the distance. Arthur followed his gaze to where Rhaenys and Jay were flying, out over the Bay of Seals. If it weren't for the light shining from Lightbringer and the flames Rhaenys was laying down, he might not have seen them at all. But as he looked at the dead moving across the ice and around the bay, he wished he still couldn't see them. He had no idea how many had attacked the wall at Castle Black. Not even Oberyn or Ned Stark had been able to provide a number, and it frustrated him greatly that no one had thought to figure it out. Knowing the odds you faced was crucial to winning battles and wars, and now he felt foolish for being so annoyed with both Oberyn and Ned. How could anyone count a number when the army stretched as far as the eye could see, with darkness beyond that point? All he could be sure of was that thousands marched across the ice and that the arrows they had fired before he reached the top of the wall had not been aimed at the true strength of the enemy they faced. "Ser Arthur. Ser Arthur," a voice called out, snapping him from his thoughts. Arthur turned to see dark shapes flying through the air toward them. "Torches, grab the torches," he commanded, swinging the one he held toward what he could now see was a dead bird that shouldn't have been able to fly. Garen. He had left. Loras positioned himself behind his men, eager to help them form ranks. He hoped he was making the right decisions for both his love and his comrades. The king had taken to the sky and headed north, and each time Loras glanced back, he saw flames raining down on the unseen enemy below. The surprise attack had interrupted their preparations, leaving him with far fewer instructions than he would have liked. Gather the water wizards and move them to the water. Prepare them for whatever may come, Jay instructed before rushing past him toward the awaiting dragon. As he sprinted, he shouted commands to his men, urging them to form up and face both the wall and the sea. They arranged themselves in an arc that nearly completed a circle, and he hoped he was making the right call. A smile broke across his face when he spotted Gilio and Harren. His grin widened even more at the sight of Nessila, already directing the water wizards to line up and head toward the sea. She understood their strengths better than anyone, and no sooner had Loras reached her than she was off again. How she knew about the attack, he couldn't say, but he heard her murmuring words as she called upon Mother Royne, followed by the crashing sound of waves against the shore. Then, everything went still, no sound, no wind, and no darkness. The water transformed into a brilliant blue as the waves ceased their crashing, forming a massive wall of water. Loras watched as it surged forward, catching birds in its grasp and dragging them down into the sea. Hundreds of them were swept away, flying toward Nessila and the other water wizards before vanishing completely. He stepped carefully over the ground that had just been covered by water, glancing down to see that the remaining liquid had already turned to ice beneath his feet. "His Grace wants us at the water's edge," he said, and Nessila nodded in response. "They intend to turn it to ice?" she asked, her eyes darting from the sea to the wall's edge. Loras knew the answer. "The words you spoke are true," he said. "The water wizards are yours to command, Nessila. I'll gather the archers to ensure you're protected if you come under attack again." He turned to move away. "The king?" she asked. "He has his own fight to win," he replied, noticing Loras in the distance approaching him. Jaehaerys Targaryen flew around rather than over the wall. Soon, they were soaring above the Bay of Seals, and he spotted them below. Without a word to Rhaenys, he signaled that she was free to unleash her flames, and she did just that. Just like with the wall of ice, it soon became clear that their flames would not melt the ice upon which the dead now walked, so he didn't even attempt it. Instead, he and Rhaenys focused their efforts on the dead themselves, incinerating as many as they could. There were more of them here than had been at Castle Black, and although their flames were devastating, they weren't enough. No matter how many times Rhaenys unleashed her fire, the dead kept marching. Despite their lifelessness, he couldn't help but think of them as something more. Jay imagined them as he would his own army and considered how he would feel if he suffered such catastrophic losses. How long could his spirit remain unbroken if thousands who fought for him fell? It made him wonder if the Night King's army was so vast that he could simply accept such losses. And then it struck him. Skane, Rhaenys. "He's heading to Skane and Skagos," he said worriedly. Looking toward the shore and the wall, now so far in the distance, he realized he had no other choice. Tell her. Tell Ellagon to fly. They reached Skagos first. The island was no longer surrounded by sea but by ice. He saw them moving toward it, and he knew what he needed to do. To his surprise, Rhaenys agreed with him without argument. He guided her down to land and spotted the shapes hidden among the ice. As they looked out at him, Rhaenys, and the advancing army of the dead, he felt a deep connection to the men and women of the north. Though he had never spoken to them and they had never knelt before him, they were his people. He refused to leave them to fall and rise again. "I'm here to help," he called out, spreading his arms wide to show that he bore no weapon. "Who are you?" a large man shouted, stepping out from behind the rocks. "My name is Jaehaerys Targaryen. I'm the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark." He noticed the reaction that his mother's name elicited. The Starks meant more to the people of Skagos than the Targaryens ever had. "You're a Stark?" a woman asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "I'm the nephew of Ned Stark, the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. I am the king of the Seven Kingdoms, and we are almost out of time. So I ask you not to look directly at the light," he explained, reaching for his sword. As he did, the large man moved for his axe. My dragon won't take kindly to that. Trust me, you'll want to deal with me, not her, and certainly not the others who march our way, Jaehaerys said, watching as the man's expression shifted to one of astonishment when they saw the light radiating from his sword. You all need to be on solid ground, he urged as they stepped back. He turned to face the army in the distance, knelt down, and closed his eyes. The light from the sword shone even brighter. Rising to his feet, he grasped the hilt of the sword with both hands and lifted it, pointing the tip toward the ice below. With all his strength, he drove it down as hard as he could. Jaehaerys struggled to maintain his grip on the hilt, but he knew it was crucial. As he did, he felt and then heard the crack of the ice. It began small, radiating out in all directions from where he stood, and it was only when the light began. Jaehaerys pulled the sword from the ice. Ray, we must go, he shouted, hearing the ice crack even more as she landed. She was back in the sky just in time. The ice around them had shattered, and Skagos was an island once more. He instructed her to fly toward the approaching army, and as they neared, she unleashed her flames. The first spear nearly caught him off guard, but they barely dodged it. The second, however, they were much more prepared for, and it was easily avoided. The ice behind them had vanished, and the sea between the remnants of the army they left behind in Skagos was now too wide for the dead to cross. He directed her to fly onto Skane, hoping that luck would be on their side once again. I'll let Ellagon know about the spears. She'll warn Dany, he said, and Ray seemed relieved by that, just as he was. Loras gazed at the sea, watching it transform into ice. The waves surged one moment and then stilled the next. From the shore to the end of the wall and beyond, what had once been a sea of water was now a solid expanse of ice. Loras didn't need to know any more than that. He gathered as many archers as he could, ensuring they carried lit torches, and left the safety of land to venture onto the now frozen sea. Once they were confident the ice wouldn't give way, having sent some men with axes to test it, though they found no success, he lined up his troops and waited. It wasn't long before he saw the number of foes marching toward them, and fear gripped him. He doubted they would be able to hold them back. He ordered the archers to prepare. As the dead came into range, he commanded them to fire. Light. Knock. Loose. Light. Knock. Loose. Light. Knock. Loose. He repeated the commands, watching as arrows flew through the air. In the air, arrows hit their targets with deadly precision. In the distance, Loras could see dead men burning, their flames illuminating the grim reality of their situation. There were simply too many foes for his archers to take down, far too many. They would run out of arrows long before they made any real impact on the advancing army. Unlike a living force, those losses wouldn't diminish the enemy's morale. As he surveyed the line where his men stood, then glanced back at the fallen in the distance, he realized he had no choice. Retreat. Retreat. Back to land. Fire at your own pace. He shouted. His men obeyed, and as they fell back, Loras looked skyward, hoping for a miracle. Remarkably, he managed to get them to solid ground without any losses. They even rearmed, and just as he was forming them back up, Garren and Arthur approached him. Loras felt a wave of relief wash over him at seeing them both safe, but his heart ached with worry for Garren. The thought of his love in danger threatened to cloud his judgment for the fight ahead. How bad is it? Arthur asked, glancing at Garren with concern. There are more than we're at Hardhome, Loras replied. The king? Garren inquired, and Loras shook his head. Send word to the princess and to Orain. We need a dragon, and it's time to start the evacuation, Arthur said. Loras looked at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. We can hold them, Arthur, he insisted, his voice more confident than he truly felt. And we will, but it'll take time to load the ships. The longer we wait, the less likely we are to finish if it becomes necessary, Arthur countered, meeting Loras's gaze. I'll send. Garen began, but their conversation was interrupted by the unmistakable roar of a dragon. Ellagon soared overhead, heading straight for the enemy marching on the ice. Loras wondered if Jae had summoned her or if it was the princess herself who had decided this was the moment to intervene. Dany. She felt the urgency through their bond. Ellagon. Dany felt an overwhelming need to fly, and she surrendered to it. As she soared over the ships, a wave of surprise and relief washed over her. People were boarding, and some had already begun to sail away from the docks. Orain must have given the order. Although she could see that the dragon's breath was still docked, it was also taking people on board. It comforted her to know they would at least be at sea, far from the land, should the dead breach their defenses. However, that comfort quickly faded as her gaze fell upon Eastwatch. Where waves had once crashed against the shore, now there was only silence. If not for the figures moving on what she knew wasn't land, she would have thought she was dreaming. The sea had transformed into ice as far as the eye could see, which, given the darkness, wasn't very far at all. From the edge of the wall to the distant horizon, everything was frozen solid. Her first instinct was to command Ellagon to unleash her flames and melt the ice, but her dragon hesitated, reluctant to use her fire in such a way. As Dany argued with her, another target emerged. Shapes moved across the ice, heading from north to south. Even without knowing their identity, Ellagon's anger and disdain for them were clear. Dany urged her dragon higher into the air, preparing for the dive and the flames to come. Jaehaerys, she commanded as they flew over the dead, and Ellagon eagerly complied. The fire ignited below, illuminating the horrifying scene that her nephew, Arthur, Loras, and the free folk had faced at Hardhome. Dany shuddered as they flew over the burning corpses, watching as the little flesh they had left was consumed by the flames. They continued to rain fire upon the undead, but it barely made a dent in their ranks. Just then, she felt herself nearly topple from Ellagon's back as her dragon. She dodged something that had been thrown at her, her heart racing as she spotted the next ice spear. Fear gripped her as she worried that even with the armor Jae had crafted for the dragons, this could still harm them. Pushing those thoughts aside, she unleashed flames, deftly avoiding 2 more spears in the process. It was then that she turned to see the men moving across the ice toward the army. She didn't know what compelled her to look, but what she saw filled her with dread. Those fools, she muttered, recognizing a figure that could only be Sandor. Anger surged within her for his reckless decision to follow her out here. With one last burst of Ellagon's flames, she pivoted and headed toward them, determined to force them back to Eastwatch. As she did, pain shot through her shoulder. An ice arrow had struck, and as she tried to pull it free, it shattered, leaving blood pooling in her hands. Suddenly, she felt herself slipping from the saddle. Her eyelids grew heavy as she crashed onto the ice. Thankfully, Ellagon dipped low just in time to catch her, or the fall would have been fatal. But even now, she feared the dead approaching her. As her eyes closed, she whispered her husband's name. Orain. Meanwhile, Jaehaerys Targaryen unleashed flame after flame, striking the army as it advanced toward the island. Like Skagos, this place was surrounded by ice, but unlike Skagos, his timing wasn't as fortunate. The dead were already here, and the battle had commenced. The Night King had underestimated the giants' true strength. He had sent a substantial force to add them to his army, and had Jae not arrived, it would have only been a matter of time before they fell. He cursed himself for his lack of foresight and for failing to execute the plans he had made. The giants were never meant to remain here, not when the fight was upon them. Jae had always envisioned this place as a home, and Mag the Mighty had assured him they were content here. However, Jae intended to use them in the upcoming battle and had made elaborate plans for their involvement. For reasons he couldn't grasp, he had completely forgotten about them. If he had time to chastise himself, he certainly would have, but urgency dictated his actions. So, he and Rhaenys focused on their mission. As he made another pass, he spotted the first of the giants. He commanded Rhaenys to incinerate the dead surrounding the White Walker, and against her will, he ordered her to land. The leap he took from her back could have been a graceful maneuver, but the reality was less elegant. He skidded on the ice rather than landing smoothly, losing the advantage he had gained. As he pushed himself to his feet, he realized the White Walker was now approaching him instead of the other way around. The creature paused when Jae drew Lightbringer, hesitating for a moment before advancing once more. The clash of Jae's sword of light against the White Walker's icy blade surprised him. The icy sword cracked and shattered upon impact. The White Walker, equally taken aback, dodged Jae's next strike, but the Valyrian steel dagger he wielded in his other hand found its mark. He felt the weight of the fall around him. While it wasn't the end, it was enough. Jae quickly climbed back onto Rhaenys's back, and together they unleashed their flames once more. When they finished, he landed near the giant's camp and felt a wave of relief wash over him as he saw that both Mag the Mighty and One were unharmed. "How many are lost?" he asked, concern etched on his face. 5. 2 of the elders, Mag replied, his voice tinged with sadness. Jae noticed a tear slip down Mag's cheek. "You can't stay here any longer, not until the battle is won. We must. We can't stay here any longer, not until the fight is won. We must march, and we must march now. I'll make sure your path is clear and your back is protected," Jae said, receiving a reluctant nod from Mag. Mag then turned to One and spoke to him before the even larger giant moved to gather the others and prepare to leave. "We march with you," Mag said firmly as he rose to his feet. As the giants got ready, Jae and Rhaenys took to the sky once more. They flew for miles, relieved to see no signs of the dead approaching. Upon returning to Skane, Jae found the giants were ready to move. It was as the march began that he felt it. "I must go, my family needs me. I'll return, or someone will. We'll see you to safety," he said, his worries evident. Mag said nothing, simply nodding as Jae flew away. It would take nearly a month for the giants to reach Eastwatch. A month on the ice, and he wished he hadn't needed to make them leave the place they had called home. Had he not just used so much magic to break the ice around Skagos, he would have done the same around Skane. If he were certain he could do it again in a day or more, he would have left them there and come back to help them. But he wasn't, and he couldn't let them fall and rise again. Yet as he and Rhaenys soared through the air faster than before, those thoughts faded away. Instead, they were haunted by the pained cry they had both heard from Ellagon when Dany had fallen. Sandor. She was supposed to stay on the ground, he thought, recalling the only reason he had agreed to keep his distance from her. As he watched the dragon soar above him and Belwas, he realized he had no other choice. The fact that he didn't even need to speak to Belwas to get him to follow was a testament to how close they had become over the years. Sandor had never been a man who cared for or sought out friendships. He never imagined he would have anyone he could truly call a friend. Grey Worm, Bonifer, Orain, Missandei, and Belwas, perhaps calling them friends felt like a disservice. Like with the princess herself, maybe he needed to recognize them for what they truly were, family. They were a far better family than the one he had been left with after Gregor committed crimes against the very gods. Now, these people were his family, and the one he truly loved, a heart he had long thought incapable of love, was now flying into danger. He ran, and Belwas ran alongside him. By the time they reached the ice, they had been joined by Grey Worm, Bonifer, and several of the Unsullied, along with some of the men Bonifer had trained. Pointing to the sky, he said nothing more, and they followed him as he stepped out onto the ice, running even faster. Sandor was out of breath when he finally spotted the flames in the distance. They had run what felt like miles, yet they were still far off. They had gathered almost 50 men, though many had refused to join them. When he saw the dragon turn and head their way, he breathed a sigh of relief, only for that breath to catch in his throat as he heard Ellagon cry out. He swore he saw Dany fall to the ground. We need to get to her. Bonifer shouted, and for once, Sandor didn't have the heart to mock the man for stating the obvious. Instead, he pushed himself to run faster than he ever had before. As he reached the princess and the dragon, he knew exactly what needed to be done. He knelt down to check if she was still breathing, and when she called his name, a smile spread across his face. Leaning forward, Sandor placed a gentle kiss on her forehead before turning to Grey Worm and Bonifer. "Get her to the dragon and out of here," he shouted. "The dragon won't." Bonifer started, but Sandor cut him off. "That dragon is smarter than any of us. She'll know what to do. Get her on her back and go, now." His voice rose with urgency, and it seemed to spur them into action. "We need to buy them time to get her to safety." "Who's with me?" he asked, scanning the men around him. He couldn't help but smirk when he caught sight of Belwaz's smiling face. "No more honeyed locusts or chicken, my friend," Belwaz quipped as Sandor watched Dany being helped onto Ellagon's back. Grey Worm and Bonifer steadied her between them while the dragon gave Sandor a long, penetrating look. He nodded, and then Ellagon took to the air. In his hand, Sandor gripped an axe made of dragonglass, its top edged with a spike of Valyrian steel. Belwaz's arak was similar, crafted with dragonglass infused into the curved blade, and its hilt featured a Valyrian steel spike serving as the pommel. With one last glance back, he saw that Ellagon was now far behind them, heading toward Eastwatch. He smiled at Belwaz, who nodded in return. "Come on, you dead fools," Sandor shouted as he charged forward. His axe struck the first enemy hard across the cheek, the blow taking off half its head. He quickly moved on to the next. He heard the first scream as one of his comrades fell, and with another swing of his axe, he sought to repay the dead for the life they had just taken. More screams echoed around him, and he tried to respond to each one, but weariness began to settle in. He almost laughed out loud when he saw the blood splattering around him. Sandor wondered how long he had been bleeding. Who had inflicted that wound? Had he given that dead bastard what he deserved? He fell to one knee, preparing to meet his gods or descend into the seven hells. Either way, he was certain he had earned it. But the blow never came. Instead, he felt himself being pulled back to his feet. Despite the bloodstains on his face and the cuts on his brow and cheek, Belwaz still wore a grin. "Your time is not yet, my friend," Belwaz said, cutting down another dead man as Sandor readied his axe. "The princess?" Sandor asked, though he already knew the answer. "She is safe and well, no doubt." "We are not," Belwaz replied, and Sandor nodded. Belwaz's scream was the last thing Sandor heard before the dead overwhelmed him, dragging him to the ground. His axe broke as he fought his way toward Belwaz, but soon he found himself facing far too many enemies to combat. He felt their knives cut into him, their hands grasping at him, and he was certain he could even feel their teeth tearing at his flesh. Then he looked up and saw the white dragon soaring above. A smile spread across his face. For the first time in his life, Sandor Clegane welcomed the flames. "I love you, little sister, always," he said as the fire engulfed him and those around him, taking them from this world into the next. Chapter 182, Mr. Night King, Tear Down This Wall, Part 5. Eastwatch, 301 AC. Orain gazed down the dimly lit path, the flickering torches guiding the way to the ships. People moved swiftly through the darkness, men, women, and children, far more orderly than he had anticipated. So far, they had successfully gotten nearly a quarter of the crowd onto the ships and out to sea. They had been fortunate, the fighting had not yet reached them. In the distance, the sounds of battle echoed, and those still waiting to board could hear it too. Although Orain managed to keep his own worries at bay for the moment, it was clear that some of the waiting passengers were beginning to feel anxious. If it weren't for the calm demeanor of the men helping to load the ships and their efficient pace, he feared panic might have set in. As it stood, they were holding together, and he hoped that when the inevitable panic did arrive, he would be ready to handle it. After a while, Orain started to usher people onto the dragon's breath, wanting to demonstrate that he was also prepared to leave when necessary. More importantly, he took comfort in knowing that his ship was also his wife's ship, and that Dany would ensure the safety of everyone aboard. He was acutely aware that she was on Ellagon, right in the heart of the chaos. Though he hadn't seen the dragon soaring through the sky, he had no doubt she was flying high. He should have felt more anxious about her safety, perhaps even fearful, but he didn't. Dany was no helpless lady, she was fierce and skilled, able to best him with a blade. He preferred her in the sky on Ellagon's back, as dragons were unmatched when airborne. History had proven that only a lucky shot could bring down a dragon in flight, while those on the ground were far more vulnerable. Ken Nat approached Orain, his expression serious. "We've loaded most of the ships, my lord. Shall we set off?" "No, not until the others are loaded." "Any word from the battle?" Orain asked, concern etched on his face. Ken Nat shook his head in response. "Should I send someone to find out how it's faring?" Ken Nat offered, but Orain quickly dismissed the idea. "No, let them do their jobs. We have our own to focus on." With a nod, Ken Nat hurried away to carry out his orders. Hours passed, though in the darkness, it was hard to gauge time. They managed to load another quarter of the ships and send them out to sea. To his relief, the panic he had feared never materialized. The evacuees had witnessed how swiftly the ships were being loaded, which helped keep them calm. Yet, despite the order around him, a nagging feeling of unease settled in Orain's gut. He couldn't pinpoint its source, but it felt almost overwhelming. Just as he prepared to move away from the dragon's breath and head toward the wall, a painful sound pierced the air. It was Ellagon, approaching with urgency. Orain's heart raced. He knew the sight of the dragon might shake the morale of those waiting to evacuate, but he couldn't stay still. He sprinted from the deck and down the gangplank. Ellagon landed a short distance away from where the Northerners and the Free Folk stood in line for the ships. Orain could feel their eyes on him as he dashed across the ground toward the dragon. Each step only heightened his fears, and when he saw Dany being carried down from Ellagon's back by Ser Bonifer and Grey Worm, dread gripped him. "Dany! Dany, I'm here. I'm here," he called out, his voice trembling as the two men laid his wife gently on the ground. "Sandor, Belwas?" Dany asked weakly. Orain turned to Grey Worm and Bonifer, who both shook their heads. "They're safe and well, my love," he lied, desperation creeping into his voice. Just then, Dany's eyes fluttered closed, and Orain cried out in panic. He lifted her from the ground, his heart pounding. Cradling Dany in his arms, Orain turned to Ellagon, whose eyes mirrored his deep concern. "Fetch a maester. There's one on the Crab's Claw, 5 ships down. Get him and bring him to the dragon's breath," he urged, his voice high-pitched and laced with panic. Bonifer quickly complied. "We need to get her to the ship," Orain said, glancing at Grey Worm, who nodded and led the way. He ran with Dany in his arms, moving slower than he had when fleeing the ship. The extra weight made it challenging, and he was careful not to run too quickly, fearing that it might worsen the wound he'd seen on her shoulder. Though there wasn't much blood flowing from the injury, which eased his worry somewhat, it looked serious. He hoped it was less severe than it appeared. Fear propelled him more than anything else at that moment, fear for his wife, fear for those around them who might see her, and fear of how she would react upon learning that Sandor and Belwas had fallen. He knew she might eventually forgive him for lying, but the loss of both men, especially Sandor, would devastate her. It was a truth she couldn't bear until she was well on the path to recovery. As they reached the dragon's breath, one of his fears began to materialize. The sight of Dany in his arms sparked panic among the onlookers. Looking down at his wife, he realized what he had to do, even though he wished he didn't. "Take her to our cabin. I'll be there shortly," he instructed as Grey Worm took her from him. Orain watched as Grey Worm carried Dany up the gangplank and onto the ship before turning his attention to the crowd, which was starting to push against one another, small fights breaking out already. It took him some time to calm them down, far too long, time he would have preferred to spend elsewhere. Eventually, though, he managed to restore order, and as they saw that the ships were still being loaded, Orain spoke in a calm and reassuring tone, letting the crowd know that the battle was still a distance away. His words seemed to have the desired effect, allowing him to move to where he truly wanted to be. Soon, he found himself by his wife's bedside, watching as the maester examined her. Dany lay still, and Orain could only hope she was resting and not suffering from something more serious. As the maester worked, Bonifer and Grey Worm recounted what had happened. Orain listened intently as they described the last moments they had seen of Belwas, Sandor, and the men who had followed Dany out onto the ice. "He told us to get the princess onto Ellagon's back, my lord," Bonifer explained, his concern for Dany evident in his voice and the way his eyes never left her still form. "He said she would take us back here, even if the princess herself couldn't command her to do so." Orain's brow furrowed as he asked, "What about the king?" Both Grey Worm and Bonifer shook their heads, deepening Orain's worry. He focused on Dany as the maester cleaned her wound and poured fire milk into it. She remained motionless, which would have alarmed him if she were not a dragon. The maester bandaged her injury, and just then, Dany mumbled his name, a hopeful sign for both Orain and the maester. After administering what looked like milk of the poppy, the maester stepped away from the bed to speak with Orain. "I've never seen a wound like this before, my lord. I can't even begin to fathom what caused it, but I can say there was little blood loss, and the wound itself is clean, even without my treatment." "It was an arrow of ice, maester," Bonifer interjected, and both the maester and Orain turned to him in disbelief. That could explain it, perhaps," the maester mused, rubbing his face. "Regardless, I believe the princess is simply suffering from the shock of the wound and the fall. She needs rest, and once she wakes, we can proceed. To give a better idea of the wound itself, I've administered some milk of the poppy to ensure she doesn't wake before she should. I'll return tomorrow to examine her again." Orain barely registered the man's words and felt a sense of relief when he left them alone. Despite the weight of his own worries, he turned to Grey Worm and Bonifer. "See to the loading of the ships," he instructed. "And check on Ellagon." Once they departed, Orain settled into the chair beside Dany's bed, taking her hand in his, and waited patiently for her to awaken. Eastwatch, 301 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen stood alongside Rhaenys, flames erupting as they approached Eastwatch. Their efforts barely made a dent in the advancing army, and he realized he would need more than just himself to halt their approach. However, Rhaenys sensed Ellagon's growing anxiety, so Jae turned his attention to her instead of the dead men below. He closed his eyes, searching for the connection that had always guided him, but found it completely shut off. "She needs to let me in. I need to calm her," he murmured. Through the mysterious bond shared by dragons, his sister communicated with the hesitant beast. The door remained firmly closed, but he caught a glimpse, enough to fulfill his purpose. Ellagon was terrified for her mother's safety, fearing that Dany had suffered serious injuries. She showed Jae and Rhaenys the arrow that had struck Dany and recounted the fall. Jae's own fears for his aunt surged within him. It was only because Ellagon had brought Dany down gently that the fall hadn't been fatal. He reassured the dragon, "Because of you, your mother will recover." He swore to her that Dany would be well again and vowed that those responsible for her harm would pay dearly for their actions. Rhaenys echoed his commitment, promising to bring fire upon them, and assured Ellagon that she too would have her chance for retribution when the time came. Dany had recovered, and that thought was what finally allowed the dragon to calm and relax. Though still worried, Rhaenys knew that seeing Dany in front of her would be enough to ease that concern. For now, calmness had to suffice. "We need to buy time. I have to go, Dany, but we need to buy time, he said aloud, half to Rhaenys and half to himself, trying to sort through his thoughts as they flew toward Eastwatch. Lightbringer felt useless in this moment, and a part of him wondered if he should have sacrificed the men and women from Skane. If he had, he might have been able to shatter the ice that now allowed the dead to roam freely around the wall at Eastwatch. It was a fleeting thought. He was not the Night King, and he couldn't simply abandon people to their fates as that monster could. There might come a day when he would have to make hard choices, but today was not that day. Those decisions would only be made when they were truly necessary. Spotting another large group of the dead moving across the ice, he felt Rhaenys's urge to see them burn for the pain they had caused Ellagon and Dany. He felt that same need rising within him. They flew low, unleashing a wall of fire that engulfed the dead. Once the flames died down, they headed toward the wall. By the time they arrived, the fighting was already over. The dead that had approached the wall had been turned back, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him, especially when he saw that they had not lost too many of their men. Go to Ellagon. I'll be here for a while, he said as he climbed down from Rhaenys's back. I'm needed here, Rhaenys replied, her reluctance to leave him clear. Go to her. She needs you more than I do, at least for now. I'll do what I must and then join you. Promise me you won't take any risks, Jay, she said, worry etched on her face. I promise, I'll take no risks, he assured her, his resolve firm as he prepared to face whatever lay ahead. He softly stroked her snout and gazed deep into her purple eyes. As Rhaenys took to the sky, he felt the worries of those approaching him begin to fade. The unease lessened even more when he unsheathed Lightbringer and started walking toward them. Whether the crowd had already been drawn to him before he revealed the sword, or if it was the sword itself that attracted them, ultimately didn't matter. We have much work to do, and it will be hard, he announced as the crowd formed around him. We have time, and Rhaenys is simply resting for now, but I'll need all of you. Gather as many swords, shovels, picks, and pieces of wood as you can. He raised his voice a bit more, and the people looked at him and the sword before springing into action. As they dispersed, Loras, Arthur, Garren, and several of the Roynish and Black brothers arrived. His friends appeared tired but unharmed, each wearing the same expression of concern. Their eyes searched his for answers that he wasn't entirely sure he had. But he did have a plan, and he hoped it wasn't foolish or wasteful. Your Grace, Loras said with a nod. Jay moved to embrace him, not caring how it looked or what message it sent. Loras, thank the gods, he whispered, feeling Loras return the embrace. Do you have a plan, Your Grace? Garren asked after Jay had greeted Arthur. We need to break the ice, to weaken it. I intend to dig and melt it, hoping to create a gap large enough so they can't simply walk around the wall, he explained. Garren nodded in understanding. If you can make the gap big enough to expose the water, then the water wizards could help, Your Grace, Garren said, his eyes bright with eagerness. Have you slept or? Have you eaten, Your Grace? Loras asked, concern etched on his face. I'm well, Loras. I have no time to sleep, not yet, he replied, noticing Loras nodding to one of Garren's men. He looked at Loras, questioning. You have time to eat, Your Grace, Loras insisted. Though he felt annoyed, he didn't have the energy to remind his friend that he wasn't a child and didn't need mothering. Instead, he simply nodded and moved with Loras, Arthur, and Garren toward the sea, or what had once been the sea, now frozen as far as the eye could see. The ships have begun to leave? He asked, walking slightly ahead of Arthur and the others with Loras. As soon as the battle truly began, I. Did you see the princess, Jay? Loras replied. She was hurt, struck by an arrow made of ice, and she fell from Ellagon's back. I don't think it's life-threatening, I'd sense it if it were, but... You wish you could be with her, Loras stated, and Jay nodded in agreement. We have work to do here, though. I'll see her once I'm done. He shifted the conversation. You got your sword. I thought you'd forgotten about me, Loras said softly. As if I could, he chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd had in days. I wanted to gift you one myself, but Garen insisted that you should have that one. I thought you'd appreciate it more coming from him. I did. Not that I wouldn't have appreciated yours, Jay, but some gifts mean more than others, he finished, his hand brushing against the favor tied to his waist. Its color had nearly faded, and it was frayed around the edges, yet it remained something he treasured greatly. Jaime and the others are well? Loras asked, and Jay nodded. Garland? I haven't been to the Night Fort in a few days. When Arthur and I visited, he and Sherera were both well, he said, noticing Loras relax a bit. I'm happy you're here, Loras said, relief washing over him. Jay, Loras said, stopping to look at him. After a small nod, Jay smirked and shook his head. Would it bother you if I said I wish I wasn't here? That I wish we were anywhere but this place? Even back at the Rock, sitting through one of Kraelin's dullest lessons? He hated mentioning the maester's name, but he knew Loras would understand. The one on the history of the great houses, Loras added with a chuckle. What are their words, Lord Loras? Jay asked, trying to make his voice sound as dull and boring as possible. The two of them laughed genuinely as they reached the shore. Jay hadn't realized how much he needed that moment until it began. Nor did he recognize how hungry he was until the first bowl of hot stew arrived. He not only finished it but also asked for a second a few moments later. Once he had eaten, he began to survey the ice, looking for the easiest place to break through. He decided to work from the edge of the wall in an arc, marking out what he thought would be the best approach. Then, the painstaking task of breaking through the ice began. He was surprised by how many picks and shovels Eastwatch had, until Cotter Pike explained that they sometimes needed to free ships from the ice to sail when the weather changed, which it often did in the Bay of Seals. Jay had them place wood in the holes they dug and set it alight to melt the ice. Then, he called on Renix to unleash her flames, making it easier to break through. Eventually, in some spots, the sea began to bubble through cracks. Jay called for Garen and the water wizards, while he, Loras, and others looked on with interest as the water wizard seemed to summon the water. What started as small bubbles soon grew larger, and then even larger, until finally, the sea began to shoot up from the holes. The ice began to crack and break apart, the sound echoing ominously around them. It was hard to tell which came first, the breaking of the ice or the storm, but as the gap widened and water crashed against the sides, Jay felt the storm's fury and knew what he had to do. The fight was no longer here, he needed to fly once more. Night Fort, 301 AC, Randall Tarley had dismissed the complaints and warnings of his men when they first arrived. The absurd notion that the castle felt wrong was something he couldn't entertain. Why would anyone choose to stay in tents and endure the cold when a perfectly good keep was available? The shared sentiment among his men only solidified Randall's belief that Garland Tyrell, though not as foolish as his father, was still a fool. And the princess, she unnerved him far more than this place ever could. How it was possible for her to be alive baffled him. When she spoke of dark magic, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was speaking more about herself than anything else. He ignored her, dismissed Garland Tyrell, and set his men to work, determined to make Night Fort both habitable and secure. To his surprise, both tasks proved to be quite easy. Compared to Icemark and Deep Lake, this keep was practically undamaged. Within days of their arrival, it felt warm and welcoming, or as warm and welcoming as a keep built into a wall of ice could be. Randall then began to drill his men daily. Those who had already mastered the fighting style the king had instructed him to teach took turns training those who had not. He stationed lookouts on top of the wall, and the waiting began, along with the dreams. Those dreams were perhaps the one thing he wished to change during his time here. Night after night, they haunted him, and not even moving to different rooms seemed to help. He did his best to hide the toll they took on him, along with the lack of sleep. Randall's brusque nature didn't help matters. Even as he spent more time alone, no one really commented. He had never been the most sociable person. At times, thoughts of his family crossed his mind, his girls, his boys, even Sam. But mostly, his mind was filled with images of cold and ice, dark shadows moving through the night. By the end of the first week, Randall began to dread the arrival of nightfall. Some of the men tried to run last night, Randall. They attempted to desert, Matthias Rowan said as they shared a meal. Damn cowards. They should be forced to run free on the other side of this wall and see how far they'd get, Randall replied, staring at his plate, his appetite vanished. I've ordered them locked up. We could have them flogged, but perhaps it's best if it's done out of sight of the others? Matthias suggested. It is. Yet, were we in another place, would have it done more publicly as a warning to the rest, Randall said with a grimace, pushing his plate away and taking a sip from his wine glass. Do you? Matthias began to speak, but when Randall turned to respond, he found himself alone. There was no sign of the other lord. Shaking it from his mind, he rose from the table and began his nightly routine. He made his way to the top of the wall, passing the men on guard. His eyes searched deep into their souls, seeking to discern their true natures. Some, he could see, were as cowardly as he feared, though a few brave souls stood among them. Randall gazed down from the top of the wall at the lands below, where tents stretched as far as the eye could see. His disapproval grew. They should be inside the keep, not out there. Damn cowards, he thought, as he made his way back down from the wall. After assessing the men in the courtyard and the barracks, he continued with his rounds. Randall approached his room, reaching out to open the door, but then turned away, heading instead to the one place in the night fort where he felt at peace. The vaults were dark, and the torch he carried barely illuminated his path. Yet he welcomed this darkness. It wasn't oppressive like the night. It didn't bring him dreams that woke him in a cold sweat or, at times, a warm one. Instead, he found solace in it. As he reached the black gate and stroked the white weirwood face, he closed his eyes, letting his breathing slow, and finally found some much-needed rest. When he eventually returned to his rooms, he couldn't tell how much time had passed, but he knew he must have spent hours in the vaults. Reluctantly, he climbed into bed, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than the dreams returned. He saw Hornhill engulfed in flames, Melissa holding Tala and crying out his name as the fire consumed them. He watched as Dickon was cut down by men in white cloaks while the dragon unleashed its fiery breath, leaving his wife and daughter gone forever. Randall called out, screamed, and shouted, but it was all in vain. Why? I'm Leal. I've always been Leal. Why? He jolted awake, feeling sweat trickle down his back, warm this time, unlike the cold sweat he was used to. He attributed it to the heat of the dragon's flames. Quickly dressing, he made his way to the great hall, where men were breaking their fasts. He took his seat alone, with no desire for company. His meal lay untouched on the table as he downed his ale and headed back outside. These men were cowards, every last one of them, and he had no interest in eating or spending more time with them than necessary. Their panicked sounds irritated him, and the questions they asked as day turned to night went ignored. As he looked up at the sky and saw that night had fallen once again, he felt his own panic rise. So, he moved away from them, leaving them behind. Randall sought solace in the one place he believed would bring him peace once more, Nightfort. It was the year 301 AC, and he stood alongside Jaehaerys, gazing up at the dark night sky, a sky that had become their reality. The arrival of this long night had sparked panic and concern among the men, and it took both his words and Shira's reassurance to calm them. The long night has come, Jaehaerys explained, her voice steady. But it will only be chased away by the dawn. Her words to the men were simpler, crafted to soothe their spirits and keep fear at bay. With him, she was more forthcoming, sharing the deeper truths about the long night and Jay's purpose in facing it. The prince that was promised will bring the dawn, she said, and for the first time since hearing Marjorie speak those words about Jay, Randall began to grasp their meaning. He hoped that dawn would arrive soon, lighting fires, speaking to the men, and keeping them occupied would only stave off their fear for so long. As dire as things were outside the walls of the night fort, the atmosphere inside was even worse. Garland had to order men to leave the keep and join their comrades outside. If Jay hadn't placed Jaehaerys in command, he wouldn't have had the authority to do that at all. Tarly, Rowan, and the others seemed to have lost their wits when it came to the comforts of the keep, and even with Shira's support, they were reluctant to let men venture out. What surprised him most was how few chose to leave. Given their anxious expressions, he had expected a mass exodus, yet fewer than 100 opted to step outside. He wished he could encourage more to join them, but he knew he couldn't push too hard. Tarly was more irritable than ever, and Randall couldn't afford to create a rift between him, Jaehaerys, and the other lords of the Reach. I cannot help those who don't wish it, Sir Garland, Jaehaerys said, pulling him from his thoughts. I know that, Garland replied, but it troubles me to see most of those men finding comfort in that ruined keep. Men seek comfort where they can, it's their nature. Their lord commands, and they follow. In time, we won't need to worry about them, Jaehaerys assured him. Garland watched her as she gazed into the distance. Jaehaerys was an enigma. He would admit to anyone other than Leonette that she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Yet, it was never just her beauty that captivated him. There was a sadness about her, an air of something he couldn't quite place. Even when she laughed or made jokes, it felt almost like an act, as if she were trying to fit into a world that didn't truly belong to her. He had initially thought this was because she seemed out of time, as if she belonged to the era of Bloodraven and Demon, not the time of Jay and Daenerys. But the more time he spent with her, the less certain he became of that idea. Are you ready? She asked, and he nodded in response. Garland called for their guards, and together they made their way to the night fort to speak with the lords and to spend some time atop the wall. It was the latter that he looked forward to, as each visit to the keep, limited as he tried to make them, left him feeling more uneasy. This time promised to be no different. He was once again frustrated to find no sign of Randall Tarly upon his arrival. He spoke with Mathis Rowan, who reassured him that although the darkness was worrisome, the men were in good spirits. Garland found that hard to believe, considering the dark expressions etched on their faces since they had arrived. Eager to return to his camp as quickly as possible, Garland glanced at Jaehaerys, who nodded in understanding. Together, they made their way to the top of the wall. As with every other visit, they found themselves gazing out at a vast expanse of nothingness, just white snow and trees, barely visible in the moonless night. They were about to head back to the courtyard when it happened. Suddenly, men swarmed around them, and Garland barely had time to unsheath his sword. He instinctively moved Jaehaerys behind him and urged her to call for Regal as he faced the men who had just killed their guards. The dark expressions he'd noticed on the men's faces earlier were nothing compared to the ferocity he saw now. Garland felt no guilt as he struck down the first and then the second man. More attackers joined the fray, but he quickly dispatched them as well. The dragon, princess? Where is the dragon? He demanded, taking a deep breath. I don't know. He's not answering me, Jaehaerys replied, her voice laced with worry. We must use the wall, he said, and she looked at him, confusion etched on her face. The narrowness at the top. We must use it to make our way to safety, he explained, and she nodded in agreement. It was the narrowness of the wall that allowed him to hold back the attackers. Only two could approach him at a time, and although they had bows and fired arrows his way, his heavy armor rendered them ineffective. He silently thanked the gods that none of them had thought to bring crossbows as he cut down two more men. Together, he and Jaehaerys moved along the top of the wall, heading toward Deep Lake and Castle Black. If the attackers had been relentless, even the narrowness would not have been enough to save them, but their sporadic assaults allowed Garland brief moments of respite. After more than an hour, during which he had slain perhaps 10 more men, they finally found a moment of quiet. As they put some distance between themselves and the night fort, the attacks gradually slowed to a halt over the next hour or two. Garland felt himself begin to relax, enough to finally turn to Jaehaerys and ask, "What the hell just happened?" "The magic of that place is dark, its history is dark," Jaehaerys replied. "How does that explain us being attacked by our own damn men?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "They are no longer our men," she said, and Garland realized he wouldn't get a better answer than that. "Your dragon?" he asked, but she shook her head. "Damn. We should make for Castle Black," Jaehaerys suggested, and he looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. There were 2 keeps between the night fort and Castle Black, covering more than 40 miles. Without food or warmth, they would be dead long before they reached their destination. If they could just get off the wall, they could light a fire or find food to sustain them until they were safe. Garland believed that once they were away from the wall, Jaehaerys would be able to call Regal to them. It was the wall itself that was blocking her connection to the dragon. He did his best to explain this as they moved toward Deep Lake, but she insisted on her plan, so he deferred to her judgment. In the end, it hardly mattered, as trouble awaited them when they reached Deep Lake. The wall had widened there, and if they wanted, they could easily send 5, 6, maybe even 7 men against him. But they didn't need to do that. At least 4 of them were armed with crossbows. He glanced from them to Jaehaerys, who shook her head. At her command, he relinquished his sword. The last he saw of her was when Randyll Tarly grabbed her. Then, darkness enveloped him as something struck him hard across the head. Night Fort, 301 AC. Jaehaerys was dragged across the top of the wall, back the way they had come. Behind her, Garland's blood fell, leaving a trail across the ice. As the icy water dripped down, she too was being dragged along. Her plea to help him had been denied, and while she was terrified for her own safety, her concern for him overshadowed everything else. They hadn't harmed her beyond the rough handling, and she bore no injuries. Garland, however, would be lucky to survive the night without some treatment. "Get up," one of the men ordered as she fell onto the ice of the wall. "No. You'll have to drag me on my hands and knees, and the first chance I get, I'll end my own life," she shot back, meeting the worried gazes of the 2 men. Their expressions told her they at least wanted her alive. "Get up," one of them repeated, kicking her hard enough to wind her. "You can beat me all you want, but I won't move until you let me treat him," she insisted, gesturing toward Garland. "He'll be dead soon enough," one of the men muttered, quickly silencing himself as Randyll Tarly approached. "A few moments, that's all," Randyll said. "And I want your word that you'll move once you're done." She nodded, eager for any opportunity to help. With determination, she tore a piece from her dress to bind Garland's wound. It was all she could do, and she hoped it would be enough. Even if he recovered enough to wake, she feared it wouldn't change their fate. As they returned to the night fort, her anxiety for herself surged. More than once, she contemplated jumping as they dragged her down the stairs and out into the courtyard. The only thing that stopped her was the hope of being placed with Garland so she could help him further. She prayed to the gods that her dragon or her nephew would arrive before they could carry out whatever intentions they had for her. Fortune smiled upon her when she and Garland were finally placed together in a cell. For the next hour, Jaehaerys fought desperately to stop the blood flow, doing everything she could to save his life. It soon became clear that time was running out. She knew deep down that her efforts might be in vain. The blow to Garland's head had been too severe, and he had lost far too much blood. He had maybe a knight, possibly 2, and even a maester wouldn't be able to save him now. As she looked down at him, lying on the cold, icy floor of their cell, she realized what she had to do. Removing the ruby from her neck, she searched for something to cut her hand with and quickly found a jagged edge on Garland's armor. Once her blood began to flow, she wrapped her hand around the ruby and spoke the words to transform it into what she needed. It took some time, but when she finally felt confident it was done, she hurried over to Garland. Raising his head gently from the ground, she placed the chain around his neck and tucked the ruby beneath his breastplate. "What in the seven hells have you done?" a voice called out as the cell door swung open. "If I'm to face my gods, then I'll face them as who I truly am," Jaehaerys replied, as the torch carried by the guard illuminated the room, revealing her true form as an old woman. "Come. Lord Tarly wishes to see you." "Leave him, he'll be dead soon enough," the guard said. As she left the cell, she took one last look at Garland, a small smile spreading across her face as she saw him move and sit up in the darkness. She had expected to be taken to the Great Hall, but instead, they led her deeper into the vaults. With each step, Jaehaerys felt her age pressing down on her. Her breathing was shallow, and a sharp pain throbbed in her chest. Little aches and pains coursed through her legs, arms, and back, and she couldn't help but laugh at the realization that she had never known such sensations before. In those fleeting moments, she was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be alive, to truly be a part of the world she had only watched from the sidelines. When she spotted the weirwood face, she understood the purpose of her journey. She turned to see Randyll Tarly and Mathis Rowan waiting for her, standing there with a mix of anticipation and expectation. Jaehaerys struggled to recall the names of some men surrounding her. Was this yet another blessing of aging, this ability to forget? If so, she wished she had sought it out much earlier. There were many moments from her past that she longed to erase. Regrets weighed heavily on her, but as she looked at Randyll Tarly, she felt those burdens begin to lift. "Your magic finally fail you, witch?" Randyll taunted. "No, for the first time, it served me true," she replied, surprised by the unfamiliar sound of her own voice. It, too, had aged. "Say the words," Randyll commanded, directing his attention to a man who appeared severely beaten. "Fuck you," the man spat defiantly, but his protest was silenced by the sword lodged in his throat. "Say the words," Randyll repeated, this time to another man, who seemed far less courageous, having suffered little. "I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers. I am the shield that guards the realms of men," the man recited, his voice trembling. Jaehaerys watched as the weirwood face opened its mouth wide enough to walk through. She felt an unseen force pushing her toward it, and despite her attempts to resist, she found herself unable to stand her ground. Her body was older, weaker, and she lacked the strength to fight back. She was pushed, dragged, and ultimately carried through the gaping mouth. "Kill all the damn cowards, Mathis, all of them," Randyll ordered as the mouth closed behind them. Night Fort, 301 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen had flown swiftly, but as he approached the Night Fort, he grew increasingly certain that he hadn't been fast enough. Never, not even in his most vivid nightmares, did he imagine he would witness the chaos unfolding before him. Men were locked in battle, those outside the Night Fort clashing with those inside. He turned to Arthur, who looked equally stunned. Just as stunned as he was, he instructed Rhaenys to roar as loudly as she could. When her roar had no effect, he moved closer to the Night Fort, where men were rushing out to join the fight against those outside. He knew what he had to do. Closing his eyes, he begged the old gods for forgiveness and commanded Rhaenys to unleash her flames upon those nearest the keep. He heard their screams as the fire engulfed them, their cries of pain and agony echoing in his ears as they realized the consequences of their actions. The fighting continued, forcing him to burn them once more, and then again. Each pass that Rhaenys made left countless bodies in her wake. He tried to suppress the thought that these were his men, that they were men at all. There would be time to grapple with the guilt and horror of what he had done, but not today. He directed Rhaenys to land further from the keep, near the edge of the camp. When she touched down, he nodded to Arthur, and they both climbed down from her back to rally the men. "Don't unleash your flames unless you have no choice. Roar and threaten, and find Regal," he instructed. Rhaenys responded with a gentle nudge, telling him to be safe. Arthur, we need to restore order and figure out what in the old god's name happened here, Jaehaerys said. Together, Jay. We move together, Arthur replied, and Jay nodded as he drew his sword. The first men who approached were led by Ser John Fossaway, who soon explained what had transpired. For no reason, the men from the Night Fort just attacked us. It took us a moment to even realize we were under attack. Garland, my aunt? Jaehaerys asked, worry creeping into his voice. I haven't seen either of them since they went into the Night Fort a day or so ago, Your Grace, Ser John replied. Form the men up. We're moving into the keep to find out what the hell is going on here, Jaehaerys commanded, determination set in his voice. Jay tried not to sound as worried as he felt, grappling with the reality of his failure. Jay, Arthur said after Ser John moved away from them. I know, Arthur, Jay replied, and they began to move. The men attacking them were the striding huntsmen of House Tarly and the golden tree of House Rowan, two of his family's most loyal houses. Yet here they were, swords drawn, trying to kill a Kingsguard and a Targaryen king. Jay barely managed to block their strikes. He was in shock that they were actually attacking him. If it hadn't been for muscle memory and Arthur shouting at him, he might have been seriously injured or even killed. It was only when he took down the first attacker that he truly grasped the gravity of the situation. They had lost their minds, turned their cloaks, and he couldn't understand why any of this was happening. He called out to Rhaenys, urging her to roar her warnings once more, but he sighed in frustration as he realized it had done no good. With no other choice, he commanded her to unleash her flames again. After 2 more passes, the tide finally began to turn. Form up, we're going inside, he said, looking at Arthur, who nodded in response. You heard the king. Form up, Arthur shouted. A crossbow bolt glanced off Jay's armor, prompting him to order the archers to fire on the men they could see. Each one that fell was another loss for his army, leaving them weaker. As they entered the Night Fort, he felt tears welling in his eyes. How many men had he burned here? How many had they lost? And yet, these men, his own men, continued to fight against him. Arthur ordered the men to secure the keep, and Jay knew that some of them would fall in the process. What had happened here? How had it come to this? Was it only happening here? The thought stopped him in his tracks, and Arthur looked at him, concern etched on his face. Jay closed his eyes, glancing towards Castle Black and then back at Eastwatch, relieved to find that things were as he had left them. Jay? Arthur asked. I needed to know if it was just here, Jay admitted. Arthur, thank the gods that it seems like it is, Jay said, relief washing over him. Arthur nodded in agreement. Tarly, Rowan. I don't understand, Arthur said, surveying the lifeless bodies scattered across the courtyard. Nor do I, Jay replied, his voice laced with concern. But we need to find them, my aunt and good brother, too. His worries deepened as the reality of the situation settled in. They had to clear the keep, room by room. In each one, men fought fiercely, refusing to surrender. As day turned into night, more and more of his men fell, and both sides suffered losses that Jay couldn't afford. By the time it was over, he felt even more exhausted than before. The fatigue hit him hard as the adrenaline from the fighting faded away. Above, Rhaenys soared, accompanied by Regal, whose worried calls echoed through the air. Jay shared that anxiety, for there was no sign of Sherera or Garland, and Randall Tarly seemed to have vanished as well. We found Rowan, Your Grace, Ser John Fossaway said, rushing toward him. Alive? Jay asked, hopeful. John nodded. Take me to him. Around them lay countless dead, thousands lost in a battle against the wrong enemy. This had to be the work of dark magic. It made no sense for things to have escalated to this point without it. Jay cursed himself as he walked, recalling what Sherera had said and reflecting on his own feelings upon arriving here. They should have moved somewhere else, left this place to its dark past, and not added more bodies to its grim history. If they had, would this have happened? Jay was certain it wouldn't have, and with each step he took and each body he saw, that certainty only grew stronger. "That's Rowan?" Jay asked, staring at the man who was beaten, battered, and now chained. "It is." "He hasn't been himself, Your Grace," Ser John said. And as far as understatements went, that was a big one. Mathis Rowan had once been a proud and noble lord. But the man before him now appeared anything but. He looked aged and drawn, having lost far too much weight. Dark circles under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights, and while that alone was concerning, the way he struggled against his chains and the words he spoke turned that concern into something much more troubling. "Cowards. Damn cowards, the lot of you. I fight for the king, the true king, not the usurper who sits on the throne. A dragon, a true dragon, not a fat stag." Mathis shouted. Jay glanced at Arthur, who stared at the lord with his mouth agape. "Princess Sherera, Ser Garland, where are they?" Jay asked as he moved closer, raising Lightbringer so the three-headed dragon emblazoned on his breastplate could be clearly seen. My king, I knew you'd come. We've fought off the traitors, my king. Randall and I, we've made up for our crimes. Forgive me, my king. Forgive us all for Storm's End. It was the Tyrells, not us, though we failed you there as well," Mathis said, no longer struggling. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he looked at Jay with pleading eyes. "I forgive you, Lord Rowan, and I name you leal and true," Jay replied. Mathis began to sob. "Ser Garland. In the cells, my king. I wish to take his head, but it's not mine to take," Mathis said with a nod. "And Princess Sherera?" "With Randall. These men were traitors, my king. They meant to hand her to the lions, they would have seen her dead just as they did." "Lord Rowan?" Jay asked softly. "The children, gods, the children. What kind of a monster? Send me forth, my king. Give me leave to attack the rock itself. Randall, Paxter, let us see the lions brought low." Mathis begged. "In time, Lord Rowan, in. I won't hold you back this time, I give you my word," Jay said. Mathis smiled, a full and genuine smile. "The princess, Lord Rowan. Where does Randall intend to take her to keep her safe?" "Beyond the wall, my king. Far from the traitors and their reach. I thank you for your service. I'll see you released once you've recovered. Ser John's men will escort you from here." "They are good men and true, Lord Rowan, just as you are," he replied, and Rowan nodded. With a nod to Ser John, he instructed him to move Mathis and the others who were still alive out to the camps. Then, he called for a guard and asked where the cells were located before he and Arthur headed in the direction the guard indicated. "What the hell did I just see?" Arthur asked as they walked. He believed he was back in the rebellion, or just after it. "I think he views the Tyrells as traitors for not riding to my father's aid and instead besieging Storm's End. His own guilt over the trident has been used against him. He should feel guilty." "Had they?" "No," Jay interrupted, reaching out to touch Arthur's shoulder. "As much as I may hate the truth, this is how it was meant to be. My family had to fall, Arthur. I wish it weren't so, but they had to fall. This world is the only one where we have a chance. My father, mother, grandmother, and Daenerys herself have all told me this." "Is he lost to us?" Arthur asked. "For now," Jay shook his head. "In time, who knows? I should never have brought them here. Gods, I've been such a damnable fool." He brushed off Arthur's words of comfort, as it wasn't the time for such sentiments. When they reached the cells, he discovered that it wasn't only Garland who was imprisoned. Worse still, he found that some had suffered more than mere confinement. Men had been tortured here, killed. sacrificed, his mind shouted at him. If it hadn't been for finding his good brother. Garland took a moment to gather himself, feeling surprisingly better than he expected. Shaerra, he asked, glancing at Jay and Arthur as they helped him out of the room. She was taken beyond the wall, Arthur replied, and Garland turned to Jay, who nodded in confirmation. My head, why doesn't it hurt? Garland asked, confusion clouding his expression. Your neck, Jay explained, pointing to the chain around Garland's neck. She gave you her ruby. Why? Garland asked, bewildered. To save your life, Jay said. Garland stiffened at this revelation. We need to find her, to save her, he declared with determination. No, we don't. I do, Jay corrected him. You and Arthur need to gather the men, regroup, and assess our situation. No one stays in the night fort itself, and I need you to move all the supplies far away from here. Rhaenys and I will go after Shaerra. I'll send for Aemon or Tyrion to provide you with dragon protection. What about Regal? Arthur inquired. He needs to leave, and he needs to leave now, Jay said firmly, noticing the worried expressions on both men's faces. Beyond the wall, 301 AC. The Night King felt the magic coursing through him as he positioned the wall of ice against the other wall, creating a bridge of ice across the gorge. He felt empowered as he froze the sea, making his moves against the islands and the wall itself. Though the efforts drained him, he recovered quickly. Each maneuver may have failed, but he accomplished everything he intended. The defenses they had set against him were more than he anticipated, yet they were manageable. The boy revealed his true colors once again. Losses had to be accepted, and sacrifices had to be made. The boy, powerful as he was, had yet to learn that lesson. So eager to save everyone, he overlooked opportunities to strike a more significant blow against his enemy. He had left himself vulnerable, and instead of seizing the moment, he had tried to save those who offered him little in return, an island he didn't even aim to conquer. His army was vast, a collection of giants that would take an age to reach him, but they would soon find themselves among his ranks. In his haste to save them all, he had nearly given up the dragon as well. The girl had fallen and had almost become his, only for luck to snatch her away. Yet he could still feel her, sense his mark upon her. In time, she too would belong to him, along with her dragon. But it wasn't her he was focused on as he watched the man approach with the other girl. The smile on his face was more for her than for the devastation he had caused at the castle. My king, the man said, and with a nod of his head, the icy swords were quickly drawn. The man spoke no more. After raising his hands, the swords rose again, truly his. He then moved to the girl, touching her skin and watching as she transformed, becoming young and beautiful once more. After all, every king needs a queen, and now that he had his, it was time for the real fight to begin. He observed the girl's struggle as the changes overcame her. Her skin turned a stunning pale white, and her eyes settled into a singular color. His smile widened as he gave the order to attack in earnest. Castle Black, the Night Fort, Eastwatch, none would stand separately, they would all be targeted at once. The full might of the army marching with him was about to be unleashed. Casualties, 7,000 men from the Reach had fallen. Randall Tarley had been slain by the Night King and risen as a white. Shaerra Seastar had been killed and reborn as the Corpse Queen.